This week, Joe Gray, senior investigator at SpyCloud, and the OSINT Nation, where we talk OSINT and social engineering. Next up, Kyle Avery, a penetration tester for Black Hills Information Security, will delve into offensive operations with Mythic. In the security news, Accenture gets lockbit. $600 million in cryptocurrency is stolen, and they started returning some of it. Lee and Jeff's data is leaked, among other senior citizens. Authentication bypass via path traversal. Downgrade attacks, Apple's backdoor. Super duper secure mode, redefining end-to-end encryption and how that doesn't work out. Pen testers file suit against Dallas County Sheriff's Department. Fingerprinting Windows, and double secret quadruple extortion. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly.
Can you pinpoint the 10 security gaps in your attack surface that account for 90% of your risk? It's impossible using a combination of scanners, pen tests, breach and attack simulation tools, and manual processes. But attackers can find your gaps. They perform recon and target the weaknesses with the best return. The Cycognito platform sees your external attack surface the way attackers do, eliminating blind spots. Powered by a global bot network, the Cycognito platform prioritizes your highest risk security gaps, integrates with existing workflows, and reduces operational costs. Visit securityweekly.com/Cycognito.
That's your cue, Larry.
Oh, hey. Wow. It's one of those days. Well, let me introduce you to the star of our show. Yeah. A man who should be hornswoggled and dipped in turds, Mr. Paul Asadoria.
Welcome, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Believe it or not, it's episode number 706. Being recorded today, August 12th, 2021, right here in G-Unit Studios in lovely Rhode Island, where my co-host, Mr. Larry Pesci, fell asleep there momentarily at the top of the show. It's okay, though. Yeah. It happens.
No, I think something in the Matrix changed because the program used to show up there and I used to see myself.
Oh.
And like,
it showed up on my program screen. I was like, Larry,
but I can't. Larry, that's you. I can't see out of that side.
You can't see that side. Oops. But we're here.
Yep, that we are.
Also here with us remotely, Mr. Lee Neely is with us. Lee, welcome.
Oh, he's over there.
He's over there.
Okay.
Yes. Hey. Looking good from Idaho, and it's fortunately the air conditioner's working inside because it's a little warm outside.
Yeah, it's warm here too. Yes, it's gonna be a hot one. Speaking of hot ones, Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us. Tyler, welcome.
Ooh, this is gonna be a long show. 2 parts of this. Larry with a patch for an eye and hopefully not a peg for a... Never mind.
It's good to have you here.
First date with me, Hook.
Oh, we do have some announcements. On August 26th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, learn how to implement cloud security that actually works. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast. That one is sponsored by Tanium. It'll feature myself, Adrian, and Ryan from Tanium. If you missed our previously recorded webcast or technical trainings, they're available for your viewing pleasure at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Joe Gray is the creator of Advanced Persistent Security, an InfoSec blog and podcast, and the first winner of the DerbyCon Social Engineering Capture the Flag competition, and a black badge recipient. He joins us today to discuss his upcoming book, Practical Social Engineering and OSINT. Welcome, Joe.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's nice to have you here, my friend. How have you been?
I'm pretty good. Pretty good.
Now, my first question, is it OSINT or OSINT?
I don't know. What did I say? Did I get it wrong?
You said it both ways.
I did?
You did.
Ah, crap.
Honestly, I don't have a solid answer for that. I've heard it pronounced both ways.
No,
So
we've debated this, Joe.
say-
We've debated this. OS is operating system. OSINT is open source intelligence gathering.
I do subscribe to the train of thought that it is pronounced OSINT, but yes. I have heard people say OSINT.
Yeah, because when I see the capital OS, I want to say OS. That's like it trips me up still.
Sorry. Exactly.
We'll get there. So what made you want to write a book? Glutton for Punishment?
Glutton for Punishment, and it was one of those things where I had given talks all over the place about a variety of topics, and I had kind of pooled everything that I had put together, and I was like, this is probably enough material to write a book. So I should pitch it. And I pitched to one publisher, and we couldn't come to terms on it. And then I came to my senses and talked to No Starch, and here we are in the final stages of getting everything lined up and getting it ready for print and release.
Very nice. What makes it different from other works on social engineering?
This one, we talk about some of the psychological concepts of it, but I spend a little bit of time in the book actually talking about OSINT and the ethics of social engineering, kind of the idea of just because you can doesn't mean you should. And then the book also, towards the end, we have the offensive section of the book where it talks through, here's how you put together a fish, here's some things for some vishing, here are some exercises to improve, referencing some things like some of Chris Hadnagy's work, some of the work of Dr. Cialdini from the psychology world. And then the final part of the book is more on the defensive side, to the effect of how we could go about defending against things. I talk about things like SPF, DChem, DMARC, but I stress more than anything that you should be testing your people, for one, but not exclusively your people. Something I talk about is don't rely solely on people to be your detection mechanisms, just as you should not rely solely on technology. And the third thing with it is you really need to look at your processes in terms of someone receives a fish or someone clicks a fish. You should have a defined process that it has been tested, whether it be via simulations, pen tests, or whatever, that allows the person to know what to do, because no two organizations are the same. Organization A, if someone clicks on a fish, they may want them to completely disconnect the computer from the network. Cool, but we have to think that we may be talking to non-technical people. And in stuff like that, I even go as far as to possibly even recommend using a specific colored network cable to say, just unplug the yellow cable. But then more explicitly, who do you call? Like, don't say call security. I tested that in a previous role. I had someone outside the organization send some stuff and it said call security, and the gate guards hated me for a week because that's who everybody called. Instead of calling information security, they called physical security. So give a specific phone number, give a specific email address, something to be able to defend against, to get your incident response process in action sooner rather than later, because you do not want to detect an incident when you're being extorted for some form of cryptocurrency.
I like the focus on process and procedures, because I feel like people get hung up on, well, we just need a training and awareness program. And I'm like, so is it a training program or is it an awareness program? Or are you just going to send simulated fishes and then send people to training or awareness? Because I feel like I feel like there's some flaws in this process, Joe.
There are, and it's something that you need to look at from a multi-pronged approach. You should be testing your people. You should be testing them with those simulated automated style phishing products that just send the things that are very easy to detect, that pretty much anybody can point out. But then I also go as far as to recommend actually bringing in a pen tester and having someone do something manually, so that you get the people get a little bit more experience in terms of what an actual adversary may do. And with the processes, like I said, no two organizations are the same. They may all be using PyCurl, but their points of contact, their language, lingo, culture, and just the way the organization is structured may vary. So using that example of call security, have a phone number. It could be a hotline number, it could be a help desk number, something, or send the email as an attachment, and you have to provide instructions on how to do that to this email address. Or if all else fails, get up and walk to this person's cubicle, and this is where they sit. And that way you have the process, because you could have all of the right training, all of the right awareness. You could have been doing the simulated phishes. They work well. You could have an incident response plan that will pass any compliance check, and the process itself be broken. There could be a disconnect between how something is detected and how it gets moved to the next stage or escalated. And I'm a bigger fan of testing the processes almost as much as the technology and the people, if not more, to be entirely honest.
Yeah,
because processes are really what breaks. To the point of something you're going to talk about in the news, the process for authorizing physical pen tests for courthouses in certain states is probably broken. And that's something that, while the pen testers in that particular scenario, they were successful in what they were trying to do, the bigger picture is they highlighted a significant process flaw between the state's court system and that particular county, and how they interact and perform authorization and notification.
So I had a question for you. So I mean, I agree about testing processes and things, particularly if it's stuff you don't do very often. But to what degree of rigor? I mean, I suspect if those guys hadn't tried that pen test on the courthouse, we'd never have known there was a problem. Everybody would have assumed that the person that said it was cool was on the right. So I'm extracting that to, how far do we go? I mean, at the one extreme, you're kicking the cords out in the data center. The other, you're sitting around a table just looking at paper. What's the right?
That's going to vary from one organization to another. And I would even say within a particular organization, it's going to vary from one team to another. Because as we look at modern threats, things like business email compromise and things to that effect, people working in things like HR, accounting, maybe even the InfoSec team and the C-suite, they have a different risk profile than someone that's in a call center with very limited access, or even someone on the help desk. So one organization, it could be dictated by their management's risk appetite. It could be directed by the industry or vertical that they are in, something to that effect that's going to say, well, there's a high probability that we could potentially suffer something. And, it's all about planning. It's all about forecasting. You could go that route, but then even within your organization, okay, what could happen if someone successfully phished or vished someone in finance or accounting? How much money could we lose? What processes do we have in place? And for the more sensitive roles like HR, accounting, the C-suite, and depending on the type of organization, it could even be parts of engineering. What additional steps do we want to put them through? And from the training perspective, that's why I advocate you may have some generic training that everyone takes, but you also need to have role-specific training that would actually address the specific problems that someone in HR or accounting may face. Because for HR, one of the easy pretexts to use when trying to perform a social engineering engagement, if you're looking at someone in HR, would be, I'm a confused job seeker, or I've previously interviewed, or I would like more information. And that's something that HR deals with quite frequently on the outside of the company. So having specific training and making them aware of particular things that could occur for what they are most likely to face. The probability
in the HR example, I think we can use technology, right? Because typically the threat vector there is HR needs to read someone's resume, right? We can give them a safe place. We can give them a safe place to do that. There's technology to solve that problem. When you talk about business email compromise, as we so call it, basically attackers are looking to steal money. That's a different set of processes and
absolutely.
awareness, right? Because basically what I tell people is, look, have a process and procedures around when you transfer money. You need to make sure you do validation steps throughout that process, like whatever it is. A lot of organizations, like in a certain circumstance, they're like, we need a fax, right? And that trips up an attacker, right? Or it doesn't get done unless I call on the phone, or in your example, walk to someone's cubicle. If you're working from home, you call the person and be like, is this authorized, right? There needs to be extra validation checks in there, because we know people are going to be really crafty in social engineering and do stuff, so there needs to be some guardrails.
And that's absolutely correct. And to your point regarding the HR example, while we can solve a lot of the stuff that HR may face with technology with regards to like reviewing resumes and stuff, but what happens when the phone rings, right? Because vishing, if you combine vishing with other forms of social engineering, whether it be phishing or baiting or anything else, you can get a whole new level of success that you never expected based on the voice thing, because you don't have those technological implementations to be able to screen anything in advance. So that's where that additional training and building the appropriate processes for releasing specific types of information or information about particular roles or hiring events or whatever, that's or even benefits, that's where that could come into play. Because, I mean, if I were going to do a social engineering engagement on a company, I may call and use vishing to talk to someone in HR and claim to be a new employee, or just had a qualifying event to have to change my insurance, and get HR to tell me, okay, well, this is who the insurance company is or whatever. And then from there, that gives me quite a bit of leeway with what I could do in terms of what types of fish I could send and what type of verbiage I may want to use in those phishing emails.
Joe, go ahead.
I was going to ask if you find there's any difference in susceptibility at larger versus smaller, where you have, in a larger, you have more separation of duty and you have, more resources behind potentially training and stuff. Or is it just that it doesn't matter because everybody's so busy?
It varies from one organization to another. In the past, some of the engagements I've done have been against very large companies or very small companies. I've been able to walk right through the door with large companies just as often as I've had the door slammed in my face, and the same applies for small companies. So a lot of it really hinges upon company culture and, to some degree, the industry and whatever they're subjected to. Like if you're dealing with someone in government contracting, there's a good chance that you may get shut down a little bit quicker than you expect with that, or at least that's been my experience.
Other than cost, are there really, truly differences in effectiveness of security awareness programs? Like, I got, simulated fish. Now I got to go do this training or awareness thing. Is there like a really big difference, you think, in effectiveness of, because there's like a dozen or more probably, right, companies that would provide that for you?
I think it depends on the company's tone and how they implement it, and basically how they are able to present and market it to the employees. Because if management and those who are administering the program talk about, this is a necessary evil, we've got to do this, it's an every year thing, people aren't going to take it seriously. They're not going to take it to heart. Whereas if management comes out and they're, I don't want to say passionate about it, but they're optimistic about it, but not like Richard Simmons level optimistic about it, then there's a higher chance of adopting it amongst the employees. They're more apt to take it seriously. But even taking that further, something I found that seems to work is, instead of
Richard Simmons have a security awareness video? Because if so, I'd watch that. That'd be hilarious.
I don't think he does. But
wonderful.
Well, there is a company, like, what's the insurance? There's an insurance company that has the guy that's always getting hurt. And then there's an awareness company. I don't remember which one, but they've got like a funny video in that same vein. Like it's the bad employee that always gets hacked, and he's like, standing over people's shoulders going, should definitely click down that link. Should definitely download that attachment. That link is totally safe. It's evil.com, but it's totally safe. Like, I think if you inject some humor in it, I think back to your point, you run the risk of like people not taking it seriously, but it being entertaining. And I forget which company has that program.
Well,
I think it's kind of cool, right? But also what you're saying is it should match the culture of your organization as well.
It should. And the other thing that comes from this is it should, what I found to be especially useful is instead of saying, this is how you protect the company's resources, because a lot of the training and the videos, they come from the lens of do this to keep the company safe. That's fine and good. And at the end of the day, we do want to keep the company safe. But what I've seen to be just as effective, if not more effective, is teach someone how to keep themselves safe. Frame it from a perspective less of the company's investing in this to protect the company. The company, instead, you want to say the company is investing in this so that you can keep you and your family, specifically your children or your grandchildren, safe. These are tidbits you can take home. And at that point, you start to plant seeds in people's mind and you start to help them develop a better, security hygiene, if you will, or security culture, a personal security culture. And then at that point, it starts to become muscle memory and they start doing the things, people start doing the things at home that you want them to do at work to be secure.
Yeah. And I like to call out sponsors that did this. They just happen to be sponsors, and they both happen to do the same. They don't solve the same exact problem, but they approach like the licensing and the strategy the same. Material security does your inbox security, so that like if you go retrieve a document from the past, you have to do a two-factor thing. So if someone compromises your email, they can't just go read all the sensitive stuff. It's just one thing that they do. And then there's Pixum, which is a browser plugin that prevents you basically from getting phished. And I apologize, I don't remember the technical like differentiators of that one, but it was really cool. It is really cool. Both of those companies, when you buy a license for an individual within your organization, they allow that person to install it on their personal systems as well, knowing that attackers not like the pen testers, right? Attackers are going to go after your Gmail account, your home account, and whatever. When we saw that with the DNC hack, it was someone's Gmail account. I can't remember the person's name. I always flake on the person's name. But they went after the person's Gmail account, right? Because you often kind of mix work and personal as well. Mm-hmm. So, and Joe, back to your point, I think it's important, not just having tools that extend to people's personal lives, but having the awareness and training extend to their personal lives as well.
Right. So, oftentimes, like, think about the password advice that we've had over, say, the last 5 or 6 years, right? Thou shalt have a password that's X characters long. It must contain 3 of the 4 typefaces, and it can't be one of your last X number of passwords, right?
And passwords are like underwear. Remember that campaign?
Yeah, exactly. So we preach that, and as security people, sometimes we get a little bit too wrapped up in that aspect of it. And when we start talking to the non-technical people, they kind of feel like we're browbeating them. And oftentimes we don't really explain why it's important to have a password of that complexity. So explaining why, as opposed to it's harder for hackers to break it. That's not an explanation. That's just words. But saying, okay, well, the longer it is, basically, here's how this is going to work. Briefly, here's how brute force works. Here's how this works, blah, blah. And I mean, possibly even a demonstration that could even help as well. But explaining why we're saying you need to have a password that's that complex, and then turning around and saying, oh, and by the way, you need to have a different password on every single application and website and resource that you use. Great. By the way, here's a password manager that you can use.
Yeah.
And then say, oh, and by the way, if you want to use it at home, like the 2 products you mentioned, I don't know of any of the major password managers that do this now, but you can use it at home in your personal machine as well. So
yeah, I was wondering how that works with password managers. Actually, like if you are a user of one product, right, for your personal, and then your company adopts it, how does that work? And then also, like, what if you're using product A, but your company's adopting product B? Is there a migration path so you can all be on the same? So I don't need two password managers.
I don't know about the migration portion, but I do know that if you use the same password manager as your employer, basically you can just have two separate vaults. So you could have your work vault on your work or personal computer or whichever, and your personal one, either or, whatever you're comfortable with. At least with one of them. I'm not sure about all of them, but I am aware of one that allows that. And that's actually something I was going to recommend is, worst case scenario, if you have to, just create another folder within your vault and say, this is my personal accounts. And I mean, it's problematic because what happens when you leave unexpectedly, or the vendor changes, or you're terminated. But
that was that was going through my head too. Like, what happens if I change jobs? Some of us change jobs, right? And now, how do I get my password vaults back? Like,
right.
Yeah.
So I mean, you can back them up.
Migrations too.
What's that, Tyler?
There's migrations and exports for each of the password vendors.
Yeah.
1Password, LastPass, they all migrate and integrate between each other pretty synonymously. And there's even recovery and backups. You can migrate certain vaults to a different email account if you are changing jobs in a certain grace period. So there's definitely ways to solve that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and
Joe, we were talking about
that,
too,
though,
like, if you had $100, what would you do to improve the security of a company? And this ties into a conversation. I had to really think about my answer. And Adrian and Tyler on ESW really liked they liked my answer, and I was like, I'd buy $100 worth of beer or alcohol, and I'd sit everyone down and I'd have a conversation with them about security. And I'm like, I'd probably hit on three things, and we've hit on some of them, right? Like, you need a password vault, and here's why. You need two-factor authentication on all your accounts, and here's why. And you probably should have a PIN on your SIM code. Like, you could debate number 3 there. I think that really stems from, I've been hearing about SIM card swapping attacks more and more. And it's really heinous, but, certainly the first two be a good conversation over $100 worth of booze, in my opinion.
Actually, your conversation reminded me of something. We had a friend who's really smart, and he was working at a company, going through their InfoSec training. Not a dumb guy. The penny didn't drop until he'd been taking it for like over 5 years, that it was, the relevance had never connected. The sitting there with a beer, you're getting past the formality. You're relaxing people so they can actually understand what the hell the point is, why it matters. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was just shocked when he said it took him, like, I think it was 7 years for it to really sink in. I'm like, whoa! But it's the same problem you're solving. It was awesome.
Absolutely. And actually, Paul, to your point there, with $100 budget, what would I do? I would probably buy one of these for demonstration purposes. It's an NVIDIA Jetson Nano, so it's like a Raspberry Pi, but it's got the NVIDIA GPU on it. So you can use Hashcat, you can do like all the machine learning stuff, and you can demonstrate a computer of this size costs less than $100, and this is what it could do.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I didn't actually know about that little hardware device. It's gonna be on my
there's
shopping
the
list.
NVIDIA Jetson line. There's, I think, 4 or 6 different models. Last year, the presentation that I gave at a lot of the conferences, the Decepticon bot, the one where it reads a certain Twitter account's tweets and then uses a recurrent neural network to generate tweets on their behalf. It was written to run on one of these. I started out in a virtual machine and it just bogged my system down. So I moved it over to a Jetson Nano, and I put the recurrent neural network through TensorFlow, and vastly sped up not only the process itself, but the accuracy of the actual bot. And then after I was done with all of the testing for that, I played with Hashcat in it quite a bit, and it was for something under $100. It did an exceptional job of cracking some passwords.
That's pretty cool. Any other tips on defense?
Yeah, really, you've just got to stay ahead of things. And honestly, on defense, something that is often overlooked, and I think may be the most important thing, would be have someone outside your organization do an OSINT assessment against your organization, because that's what the adversaries are working from. Sure, there's some stuff with like the low-hanging fruit. Okay, I found them on Shodan, I found them here, I found them there, there's this. But if you've got someone who's really trying to be persistent and someone who's a little bit more advanced, trying to really gain access to that organization, the amount of stuff they can find via OSINT, and I'm not just talking like employee social media. I'm referring more to things that you have in your DNS, like text records. Do they still need to be there? What kind of information are you giving away regarding your email platform? Like what can someone learn about your organization and your architecture from MX records? I mean, I can find out who your mail provider or your mail filtering service is from that. If I can't find out from MX, which I can, but if I couldn't, there's DMARC as well. The DMARC record will give that information away. And then the amount of stuff that you can find through passive subdomain enumeration, job postings, the number of times that I've looked through job postings for an organization that I've been investigating, and I've seen specific software versions that are vulnerable mentioned in the job postings. That's a big one. And then it should be incorporated within your training to the employees, but to some degree, the corporate social media and high level employee social media. And that's the reason why I say that that someone external to the organization should be the one to do it. Because if you have an investigator that goes through and conducts that assessment, they can look through all of your employees' social media that's public. They can find the things of relevance that could actually be harmful to the business without finding out personal things or getting too invasive about employee habits. And it lessens the probability of a potential manager using the data to be abusive to employees. So that's pretty important. And then just general OSINT, like data breach stuff. Traditionally, when I've came across like passwords, like using something like dhashed or one of the other tools out there, whether it be on an Onion site or the clear web, I typically ask the question of an organization, do you want to know whose passwords have been breached, or do you want to know which passwords have been breached? I won't give up the password as it's associated with a person, because I have no assurance that the person receiving this information or someone with access to that information may not try to log into someone's personal accounts or do other abusive activities with it. So having a consultant to do that type of engagement allows them to be the filter, not the pump, and give the business more of what is actually valuable that can actually make a difference within the business. Because if a lot of businesses would just be more vague with some of the stuff they put out there, they could greatly enhance their security. The number of times that I've just done Google Dorks or looked through a few websites and found highly sensitive information about a company on the company's website, not even on like S3 buckets or DigitalOcean spaces. It's unreal. And a lot of times the companies don't even realize it's there. It wasn't supposed to be there. It got there. They didn't know it was there. So having someone come through and do the investigation, I would say annually at least. Better would be 6 months, and ideally would probably even be quarterly, to see what's new, what's changed, what's gone, what's still there, what can be found. Because that's what's going to lead to what I call the context for the contact. And that could lead, like the amount of information someone could collect using OSINT techniques could lead to highly focused and aggressive social engineering, but it could also save a lot of time in red team activities or unauthorized red team activities, just the straight malicious side of it. If they're seeing job postings for a vulnerable version of SolarWinds, then that saves them from having to run Nmap and get detected by a SOC.
Well, I also think it's a valuable tool for the end user's awareness as well, because the end user knowing that the information is accessible, I think arms them to be better equipped to handle social engineering. Because I think most users are like, oh, well, the only way they would know that is if it really were my bank or whatever, But when they realize that this information can be discovered, I think it better equips the user to handle the situation.
It does. And in that case, when the business is actually talking to the employees and debriefing it, they should say something to the effect of, we did not want to personally invade your privacy. We want to maintain the right relationships. So we hired a firm to do this type of engagement. This was the scope of it. And the information that you're being provided was collected by someone else. And we asked them to only give us stuff that is relevant to the business. We didn't ask for anything personal about you. We didn't get any of your passwords or any of that kind of stuff. Just as a level of reassurance to try to maintain a certain level of trust between the company and the employees. But because one of the worst things that could happen is the employees start to believe that the company is trying to be Big Brother.
So simulated phish, in addition to penetration testing and an awareness program.
Plus the proactive external OSINT.
Yeah.
Because the OSINT, you could do the OSINT as part of either the pen testing or the social engineering, or you could just do it independently. And there's really, there are pros and cons to doing it independently or as part of something else. Personally, I would say probably do a thorough full scope OSINT engagement first, and then leverage that information as part of the social engineering and as part of the pen testing. Because let's face it, OSINT is pretty much, if we want to look at the ethical hacking process, OSINT is the passive reconnaissance phase. So pen testers often already do some of that stuff anyway. They're not looking at the same level of verbosity that some of the OSINT investigators are, but they're still looking for a lot of the same information.
Do you find that if you just did the OSINT investigation without the other steps, that you'd get I can accept the risk of all that, it's not that bad, nobody can do anything with it? Or does it carry weight on its own?
It varies. And from a professional sense, with most of the engagements that I've been involved with, they've actively sought out the organization that I was working for in doing the engagement. So they were already concerned about it. So they took it to heart very, very heavily. On the other side, though, when I've found things and I've submitted either as a bug bounty or like via disclosure.io or just through the appropriate responsible disclosure methods, it's feast or famine. They're either like, oh, thank you very much, we're so appreciative, or shoo fly, get out of here, we don't care at all. So I stopped submitting it on bug bounties because on both BugCrowd and HackerOne, I had submitted several things that I had found that I considered to be like, I wouldn't give it like a priority one because it's not like a remote code execution, but I would give it a priority one OSINT, which I would probably say maybe like a priority 3 otherwise. But I've submitted things and they're like, yeah, this doesn't meet the requirements of the bug bounty. I was like, well, I understand that. I'm telling you this information, and then it ends up getting marked NA, and then that hurts my reputation score. So I just stopped using the platforms, and if I have something, I just directly go to the organization now, so that I don't have to worry about my reputation score going down.
Flipping to the red team side, I had a question. It'll come back to me because you talked for a while when I had the question in my head, and now I forgot it. Oh, you said in your book that you had tips for getting better at social engineering. But are there works that we should read? I know Nagy has interviews like a lot of interesting guests on psychology and other such topics. Like, what are your tips for getting better at social engineering?
So I talk about the books, a lot of the same stuff that you would hear from Chris Hadnagy and company, and it's read his work with caution. Read Frank Avangale and Kevin Mitnick's work. Consider some of the other psychology works, and then listen to podcasts like his and other psychology focused podcasts. But I talk a lot about like how to improve your interpersonal communications. Like, for example, go strike up a conversation with some random stranger and have an objective of a piece of information you want to get. And it doesn't have to be anything invasive, but have something that you ultimately want to lead up to getting the person to tell you. And have those conversations with strangers, because when you're doing like the vishing stuff, there's really only one way to get better at it, and that's to do it. And if it's harder to talk to people face to face than it is on the phone, or at least to me. So if you can go and strike up conversations with random strangers and extract small tidbits of benign information out of them, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to massage the conversation when you're on the phone in a higher pressure environment, where you really need to excel and be successful. You're already used to it. And then I talk about things like take a public speaking class, take a technical writing class, possibly join Toastmasters, present at your local B-sides or DEF CON groups or what have you. And, be active in the community, be on Twitter, be on LinkedIn, that kind of the general stuff that I would tell anyone going into InfoSec. But you need to be able to communicate. And the thing is with regards to like social engineering, you need to be able to write those technical reports. So a technical writing class is great, but then you also need to be able to adjust your tone so that when you're writing those phishing emails, you're not sounding like you're writing a technical report, or you're not sounding like a robot. So unless that's part of your pretext, because there are pretexts out there that you could use where you purposely make mistakes. So that's a lot of the big stuff. And then the other thing is, I tell people, if you have access to like a college library online or anything, either as an alumni or as a student at like a community college or whatever, go and read what's in the psychology and sociology journals, especially as it relates to three specific terms, and that's persuasion, manipulation, and influence. And then even if you're more interested in social engineering than you are OSINT, still study up on your OSINT, because the better OSINT is going to make better social engineering. You're going to have a more informed approach coming in. For example, if you were doing an engagement against Walmart or Disney, with proper OSINT, you would know that Walmart's employees are called associates and Disney's employees are called cast members. If you call them an employee on a call or in an email, you're done. You're going to get discovered far too quickly. So don't discount the OSINT, and go read the appropriate works. Obviously, anything written by Michael Basil, Chris Kubecka has good stuff. There's other good stuff out there. With OSINT, there's a lot of blogs about it at any given time. Be active. I run my own Discord server. There are, I think, about 5 or 6 other OSINT Discord servers that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are more, but be active. And then, of course, your typical social media event stuff for that as well.
What's your favorite kind of meat to smoke?
It's funny you should say that, because right after I got out of the hospital last week, I bought a pellet smoker. And I decided that I was going to smoke a copious amount of St. Louis style ribs.
Nice.
So as of right now, that's my favorite, but literally the only things I have put in the pellet smoker have been steak, ribs, burgers, and corn on the cob. I'm conflicted as to what's next, whether it will be wings, beer can chicken, brisket, or pork butt.
Why not all?
Why not all?
I can only eat so much, guys.
That's true. That's true.
I'm trying not to gain the weight that I lost back.
This is true. So which pellet smoker did you get?
It is the Pit Boss Lockhart. It's the one from Walmart. It's got the smoker with the grill function, the charbroiler in it, and then it's got it. It still smokes, but it doesn't get up to the same temperature. The 4 racks above it, so it's kind of like a heating area as well, and it holds 40 pounds of pellets.
I like the pellet smokers because it's much easier.
Yeah,
like, you know, you got, especially if you got kids at home and other stuff going on.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's so much easier than babysitting a traditional smoker and having to adjust to keep it right between 225 and 250. And then, you know, when you open it up to flip something over or spray it with vinegar, then you've got to readjust the airflow, and then you can only leave it adjusted for so long, because if you don't, then it's going to pop up to like 400, and then you're going to have to choke everything out and then restart it again. And yeah.
I don't want to be that tied to all the time.
Yeah. And that was the same. I bought one of the Komodos, the big green egg clone. And
they had a bunch of those at a local Ace Hardware.
Yeah, to babysit
they had like
it.
every single model. They had a tiny one all the way up. There was like $2,600. The thing was massive. It was massive.
Like that had to babysit, and like then you start building a microcontroller to do the fan so it could maintain temperature or not, and like that was a Saturday where you could sit outside with a beer and just sit there and watch the thing. And then I bought the electric smoker, and that was like set it and forget it, except that it tends to go through wood fairly quickly.
Yeah, if you use the chips, it'll burn through the chips.
Which does. But the only thing that I like about that, it can do cold smoking. So I don't have to turn on any heating element, nothing. I can just smoke with the add-on.
Right.
And you can do heat and smoke. But I picked up the Davy Crockett Green Mountain Grills smoker, and that is fantastic.
Is that a pellet or
pellet? Yeah, it's about 30 pounds of pellets, which we've put stuff in there for 5-6 hours, and not used half the thing.
Yeah, if you're low and slow, I find you don't burn. If you crank it up to 500, you're going to burn through some pellets.
Oh, sure.
But not get as much smoke, because they combust so well. You don't get as much smoke at higher temperatures. It's interesting.
Yeah, I made that mistake. When I bought the pellet grill, I bought 120 pounds of pellets, thinking, I was like, I don't know how much I'm going to use during 6.5 hours of smoking ribs. And I think I may have used like 5 or 10 pounds tops.
Yeah, now you're set.
Doesn't go bad. Yeah, I don't think it goes, as long as you store it in a nice, cool, dry place, you're good.
Yeah, it should be good. I think I'll be good for buying pellets for probably about the next year, with the exception of if I want to get a different flavor, because they are all the same flavor or type of wood, whatever you want to call it, because that's all the store had the day I bought the smoker.
Yep. The one that is nice about mine is that it runs off of 12 volts.
Oh,
and
that's nice.
And it comes with a really long cord that you can plug into the cigarette adapter of your car. So you could use it for like tailgating. We used it when we went camping.
Yep.
Because we're boondocking, we're off grid, and everything is 12 volts. So I could just go plug it into the battery for the camper.
Nice.
And we did an amazing set of baby back ribs in the campsite. Like everybody was riding on their bikes and walking by and like wondering why the smoke is pouring out of our campsite. And then you see them drooling, and they're like, "No, you can't come for dinner."
I'm smoking like 8 racks of ribs this coming Sunday.
Yeah, with your family, you need about 8 racks of ribs.
Well, we're having people over. Yeah, for a party. So
yeah, I had a lot of my family over, and I smoked 6 racks of ribs. So
if you stack them vertically, if you stand them up in a rib rack, you can get a lot on there. It's nice.
Yeah.
I learned about those about 3 days ago when I was looking for a rack to make beer can chicken on Amazon. So unfortunately, I did it the hard way. Hence the reason I was so precise with what I was saying about having to babysit the traditional smoker.
But Traeger makes a chicken throne, and it's just a ceramic thing, and you pour the beer in, but it flares out so your chicken's not falling over. That's what I use. It comes out good. Yeah, it comes out really good.
Nice.
I like the beer can chicken.
I've not had it, but it looks looks really interesting.
Nice.
I like talking about smoking meat as a kind of a nice break from OSINT.
Is there really ever a break from it?
Right.
The beautiful thing with the pellet, so that's one thing that I do actually like about it. It's like, oh, well, I'm sitting outside with this pellet smoker. It's doing its thing. Okay, cool. I can control it via the app if I want to. If I'm not actively having to sit down there and spray it with vinegar, I could be up here in my office doing whatever,
Yep.
or if I'm stuck sitting out there, a lot of the stuff that I would do from an OSINT perspective, like, yeah, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of like command line tools and other tools I could use, but there's just as much stuff that I can go digging through in the browser, and I could still be collecting down there. And I don't ever really have to truly turn it off if I don't really want to. But I am trying to strike a better work-life balance and take a little bit more time away from my OSINT hobbies and what have you, and be more concise, so that I do have a better balance to prevent burnout.
When does the book officially come out?
I don't have the exact date. My stint in the hospital kind of slowed things down because I've got a couple of changes that I've had to send back to No Starch. So I don't have an exact date, but I do anticipate that it will be in print by the end of the year.
Nice.
The original date was going to be this month, but obviously medical issues said nope. Otherwise, nope, you're wrong.
Nope, you're wrong.
It is available for pre-order on No Starch's website.
It is, and the last time I checked, if you use coupon code pre-order when ordering the physical copy of the book, not only do you get a discount, but you also get immediate access to the digital early release portion as well.
Yeah, that's something that they started doing. A lot of publishers started doing is you buy the pre-release and they'll give you access to the electronic copies and you can read it as it's being edited, which is kind of nice.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, it's still going through the editing process. So, like, if you see something like they tell you that. So, that's awesome. Good stuff, Joe.
I'm very excited for it.
Yeah. Anything else other than the book? Anything else you want to plug?
I do my training through the Ascension, the OSINTion.com. I created a coupon code just before I came on. So anyone that's listening that wants to take any of my virtual live trainings between now and I think the last course is December 18th. I've got 6 different courses. I'll save you the gory details of what all the courses are. But if you use coupon code PSW15, you get 15% off. Beyond that, no, the only thing new in my world besides that is my team, we competed at the Trace Labs OSINT search party at DEF CON this last weekend. And for the second year in a row, we won the OSINT search party missing person CTF.
Congrats, man. That's awesome.
Thanks. Really exciting. It's OSINT for good. It actually seeks to make a difference, and there's definitely there's some really high highs, and at times there's some really low lows in the competition, but it's definitely exciting, and I'm always happy to try to assist in finding people. But I think I'm done competing. I'm going to move over to the judging side from now on, and possibly mentor some teams from time to time as well.
Fantastic. Well, the links to the Ascension are in the show notes. Practical Social Engineering is the book. Joe, thank you very much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Thanks for having me.
With that, we'll take a short break. Coming up next, Kyle Avery. Stick around.
Keeping up with security issues across thousands of web assets without the right approach to web application security is a daunting task. Get ahead with web vulnerability scanning automation from NetSparker, a leader in dynamic and interactive application security testing known for its ease of use and accurate results. Detect a wide range of vulnerabilities in all legacy and modern web applications, address security bugs at scale by automating the confirmation process, automatically prioritize vulnerabilities, and assign actionable tickets to the right developers in their native workflows for rapid remediation. For more information on how to scale application security with ease, visit securityweekly.com/NetSparker.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. SC Media debuts its all-new SC Digital experience, fully integrated with Security Weekly podcast content and more. The new site increases the scope and scale of original content resources from editorial staff, contributors, and the far-reaching Cyber Risk Alliance network. Visit scmagazine.com to check out the new look. Even though we don't have an actual magazine, it's digital right at this point.
It's an e-zine. As the kids,
right?
As I was going to say, as the kids used to say, no,
as us old folks call it.
Yep.
Joining us for this segment is Kyle Avery. Kyle is a penetration tester with a lifelong love for tinkering with computers. His hobbies include Hack the Box, home labbing, and catching the latest InfoSec drama on Twitter. Today, he joins us to discuss offensive operations with Mythic. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you.
Kyle, it's nice to have you. How did you get your start in information security?
Well, so my dad actually works in information technology. He works in infrastructure, servers, and storage. And so growing up, we've always done computer projects at home. For a long time, we had Active Directory and roaming home folders and all these things where you could sign into any computer in the house. And so just growing up, I've kind of always been into just general IT and things like that. And then as I kind of got older, I grew to get more into pen testing and offensive security. And so now that's kind of what I focus on.
And how did you meet up with John and the Black Hills team?
So kind of funny story. I started there as an intern originally. And so I was just sort of browsing Twitter, as you kind of mentioned I do. And I think it was Marcello, Pipe Leader. He posted that they were hiring interns. And so I sort of just raced to send him a message and did this sort of interview and got in that way. And then when I was ready to graduate school, they brought me on full time.
That's awesome. Do you live in the South Dakota area or do you work remotely?
I work remote. I've never even been to South Dakota, actually. Gotcha. I'm going in September for the conference, for Deadwood finally. Yeah. But yeah, I live in Texas, so I'm nowhere near there.
Gotcha. Well, that's awesome.
I'm kind of curious. You got an early start. Do you feel that having all that tech in your house and having parents that kind of facilitated some of that, do you feel like that pushed you more into technology, or do you feel like there are times that also causes you to go the opposite way?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, it definitely helps push me in this direction, right? I mean, growing up, it was hard to imagine doing much else just because that was like the thing that I knew how to do. And it was really fun. I've never been bored with it or tired of doing it. And so that was always sort of a good quality to me. But I looked at some of my friends and things that went into careers that were unrelated to what their parents did. And, it made me I'm starting to sort of wonder at times, I wonder what else I maybe would have done otherwise. But I really can't even imagine doing anything else because A, it's super fun, and B, it's just what I've always done. So.
Yeah, I found, with 3 kids at home, and I think many of us have the same experiences that it doesn't matter how much or how little you push your children in a certain direction to get interested in something. Like you, Kyle, if they're going to be into it, they're going to be into it, right? And you give them that environment. I mean, all my kids have computers and tablets. It's available to them. Mm-hmm. If they want to latch onto it, great. They want to do something else, great, right? I'm not going to, I can only slightly influence that. I can make it available, and then it's basically up to them. So good for you for latching onto it. Because I've got, Jack that worked for us for a while. Yeah. He was one that just latched onto it, right?
Yep.
His brother, not so much, but nothing wrong with that.
And brings whole new, thought to the some of the best pen testers we've seen spent their lives growing up in infrastructure and Active Directory and networking, and like this brings a whole new spin to that growing up into and now becoming a pen tester. And
because like growing up for us was like we had to build the one computer in the house,
or we had to manage DNS and DHCP in an enterprise network for 6 months because no one else would do it.
Right.
And
yeah, today it's different.
Yeah,
all good though. Kyle, tell us about Mythic. How did you find Mythic, and what is it?
Yeah, so Mythic is, at least it's a C2 framework, a command and control framework. And so if you're familiar with like the C2 matrix, that's like an effort from, I believe it's associated with Scythe. I'm not sure if it's like formally, but it's basically an effort to sort of catalog all the different command and control frameworks. So, I mean, Cobalt Strike and Metasploit and Empire and dozens more. And so through some just internal projects at work, we were looking for, a tool to fill a certain void. And that's where I came across this. And ever since I found this and then have kind of been working with it, it's definitely just been like one of my favorite tools that I found.
I've always wanted to write. I've always wanted to write one. Like I did a bunch of Python development, like hard and heavy for a while. And I was like, I'd love to write a C2 framework. And then you click what is Mike Poor's expression? You click your heels twice and you Google search for it, and at least 3 other people have already done it, right? And so when I saw this was Python C2 framework, I'm like, yep, someone's already done it. I'm like, that's cool.
Sure. And the cool thing about Mythic is that, as you'll kind of see, is it's sort of meant to help you build your own piece of the framework. So it sort of like does a lot of the work for you in building your own framework, but still gives you quite a bit of control on pieces that you'd like to make from scratch. And so that's where I think it's really useful is that it sort of saves a lot of development time from making something like that from scratch.
Yeah. And it's all the modules are written in Python?
So all of the like server side code and sort of the like back end is primarily Python. Yeah.
And did you develop a new wrapper or module? What do they call it?
So there are a bunch of different things in Mythic. One of them being wrapper payloads, and I'm going to get into that. But yes, I recently released a wrapper payload for Mythic. Just on Monday, I put out a blog post about sort of a use case of Mythic that I'm going to talk about. And I've been working on a few other things as well that I hope to release in the upcoming weeks, I guess.
And do you write those in Python, or do you write the payloads in a different language and they just get delivered through the Python framework?
Right. So the Python components are sort of the bits that interact with the Mythic core server or with, the Mythic web interface. But you can write the payloads or the wrappers or the network profiles that I'm going to talk about in really any language. It doesn't matter. As long as you can interact, as long as you can have these sort of Python scripts that define and sort of maintain these things that you write.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, you got some slides, so let's dig into it.
Yeah. Let me switch over here. All right. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Great. So like we've already said, I'm talking about offensive operations with Mythic. So just a quick little thing. I know I already sort of introduced myself, but I'm a pen tester and a developer with Black Hills. I'm also an instructor with Wild West Hackenfest. I put my Twitter and GitHub there, so feel free to follow those. So just a quick agenda. I'm going to start off
sorry,
with...
Kyle. So which class are you teaching for Black Hills?
Yeah. I teach Windows post-exploitation. And so the class is all about what to do once you've established your C2 or gotten your sort of shell in the environment, what to do next, and how to kind of get from that initial access to whatever your goals are.
Sweet.
So back to the agenda, I'm going to talk about what exactly Mythic is, a little bit about what makes it unique, although that's kind of what the whole presentation is going to be. We'll talk about some payload types, which is the actual implants themselves and how you can modify those for your own uses. We'll go into what exactly wrapper payloads are and how you can make those. I'll touch on automated deployment to sort of speed up using Mythic and getting started. And then finally, I'll just talk about like what I think some practical use cases are and how Mythic in particular solves some problems that other tools don't. So we'll jump into the overview. So kind of like I said, Mythic is a C2 framework. it does all the things that a C2 framework does, but it also does many more things. So some of the sort of like highlights, I guess, each implant that you use in Mythic, and you'll see that there are many kinds of implants publicly available or that you could make yourself. Any kind of implant you use in this framework has these sort of very customizable build environments. So we talked about these Python scripts that you can use to sort of interact with the Mythic server and with the web interface. And what you do with these when you're working on payload types is you actually define, configuration options and then the actual system commands used to build the payloads. And so you'll see that gives you a lot of control over exactly how you compile things. Do you want to include or exclude sections of the code before you build it? Do you want to, perform obfuscation at build time? All these different things. It also offers interchangeable network profiles. So the Mythic server itself only speaks one sort of language that implants could talk to it over. And so what is intended to be used are these sort of middleware, almost like redirectors, basically, that sit in between the Mythic core server and implants. And these network profiles can be a variety of protocols and are independent of the core server. So you can add new network protocols to the framework without touching the core code, which I think is pretty cool. And then finally, as you might be like picking up on from this, is that it's very modular. And so each of these components can be switched out and new ones can be added very quickly. And sort of you can sort of pick which components and which pieces you'd like to use on an engagement or on an operation or whatever it is. And so it's my opinion that this like modular nature is what makes Mythic sort of the like next evolution of what a C2 framework really is. So that's what I hope to kind of show you today.
Yeah,
so
it's pretty
like
amazing. I'm looking at their GitHub, Kyle. Like, it's an amazing application, right? I mean, there's a lot going on. They've got the Nginx web server, Postgres database, RabbitMQ, Redis server. There's a lot of traditional like application development components that go into this, which is pretty cool.
Right. And I'm actually going to go over those specifically
awesome.
in just a minute. No, that's okay.
Because it's good.
But it is cool.
I didn't know what Hasura was, so I'm hoping you can explain it to me.
yeah, I'll cover that briefly.
Awesome.
Basically, it's sort of like an intermediate layer between you and a database that sort of abstracts
database abstraction
database
layer,
specifics.
Yeah.
So you don't have to speak PostgreSQL, and theoretically, you could like switch out PostgreSQL for any database.
Love it.
And keep using the same queries and things. But yeah, so just real quick, I figured I'd do I wouldn't really even call this a demo yet, but this is going to be just me showing you what Mythic kind of looks like, and so you can get a general feel before we jump into it. So when you log into Mythic, this is what you're going to see. You've got all of these tabs at the top. You set an operation name, so I called mine Security Weekly. And you can sort of create things. So I can create a new payload if I want. I can view my active callbacks, which is where I would sort of manage the implants that have connected back to my server. And then here's where I can sort of manage like what payloads are connected. So you'll see I've got this Atlas payload and then this Scarecrow wrapper, and that's what we're going to talk about here in a little bit. As far as profiles go, we've got just an HTTP profile so that we can use HTTP traffic for egress communication. But yeah, so we're going to jump into this a bunch, but I figured just before I get too deep into talking about the components, I'd kind of give people a sort of like bird's eye view of what it looked like. So let's just jump back and we can talk about these components. So this is what we were just talking about a second ago. And this is kind of overwhelming at first. Like there's all these components. But really the key bits are on the far left, you see the React web user interface. And that is React, if you're not familiar, is a JavaScript framework for front-end development. And so that's what they wrote that web application that I showed you in. And that's where you sort of manage all of this. And that communicates with an Nginx proxy, which sort of gives you access to the core web server as well as a documentation server. So each payload contains a folder with markdown files. And if you browse to the docs page, you can see the markdown files sort of parsed and made to look nice. So you can read about how the payloads work and what commands they have. But all of this is stored in a PostgreSQL database. And the real key here, and what we're going to focus on a lot today, are these two sets of boxes on the right. So at the top, that is sort of the collection of payload type containers. And so each Docker container in that box represents a different implant that you could create executables for. So there might be, say, a Windows C# implant and a Mac implant that's in Python. And each of these have their own containers where you sort of interact and generate new implants from. And we'll talk about those right after this. And then in addition to that, at the bottom right, each of those containers is a network profile. So just like the HTTP profile that I showed briefly, those are the sort of middleware in between the implant. And you can see that, or hopefully you can see that small icon at the very bottom right. And that's the logo for one of the implants. And it sort of communicates through one of these Docker profiles, for example, the HTTP protocol. And then that is what's used to communicate back with the core server. And so you can see how the payloads and the network profiles are interchangeable and don't really impact that sort of center box that is all the core components of Mythic. And
so the
each
containers,
of these
so Kyle, the containers at the top, that's where the payloads are like generated and stored. Is that correct?
They're generated there. I believe they're stored just maybe in the PostgreSQL database or somewhere that you can just download them from the web user interface. I'm not actually, they might just be stored in the file system, I guess.
Gotcha.
But the way that you grab them is just through that web interface.
Is that because they need a different environment to actually build the payload, right? Depending on what you're
building. And
building?
that's it. Yeah, so you give it just the tools it needs to compile or build or whatever your payload.
I gotcha. And then there's
just output some file.
And then there's a different set of Docker containers that do the TCP/IP communications from the C2.
Correct.
I'm like really impressed with their design, quite frankly.
I'm
or DNS or SMB, like, not just TCP.
Yeah.
So they have an HTTP container, they have a DNS, they have a WebSockets. There's an SMB one, but I don't think it's functional at the moment. But yeah, they've got like lots of examples, and the idea is that you could write this for anything. If you wanted to add an ICMP one, you would just have to write something that took in ICMP traffic and converted that to whatever that central web server wanted. And then, any implant that you implemented ICMP traffic with should work with this framework.
It's an amazing architecture. I really like it.
I 100% agree. At first, it's sort of like a lot to take in, especially as you start working with it and you have to figure out like which components you're working with.
It's like an enterprise, like this is how a lot of folks design an enterprise level application.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely a lot of thought went into, and they've like sort of refined this over time. Like some pieces are new and some things have been removed.
Yeah, like what is the SANIC web server? What is that?
So SANIC is a Python web server, so it's like a Flask replacement.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I think
Flask
that was like the developer's preference.
I develop in Flask, and it's really dated.
Yeah, so SANIC, I mean, I'm assuming from the name that it's meant to be a pretty lightweight and fast web server, but I honestly don't know a ton about it.
Gotcha.
But and that's the nice part about Mythic, right? Is that you don't have to know anything about how the like core C2 server works to add things to it.
Right.
And that's where I feel like with other frameworks, you have to come in and make all these changes to the core code that might break things that other people are working on. Whereas here, you just make changes to these, outside containers for what you want it to do, or you add new ones for new functionality, and it won't impact anyone else using the framework, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty slick.
So kind of jumping into payload containers and C2 profiles. So payload containers, they are totally freestanding. So each payload type container is totally separate from the others. And it alone builds the payload. It has no external dependencies, which is kind of the point of a Docker container, I suppose. Mm-hmm. But they have examples of these. There's a couple C# payloads. There's a PowerShell payload. There's Golang payloads. There's Python. There's a NIM payload. So they have so many examples that either the core developers have made or just people in the open source community have made, which is really cool to see. People kind of contributing things to this. And so there's a Mythic Agents GitHub page that is separate, and that's where you can find all of the publicly available implants for Mythic. And same thing with the C2 profile. Those are also, I believe, on the Mythic Agents page. And so they've got the HTTP, they've got DNS, they've got WebSockets. I think there's others, like one or two others that I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but those are like the core C2 profiles that they offer. But yeah, so like with this, I guess, I don't know, let's just jump in. There's not much more to say on that. So in like a perfect world, right, you would make your own payload from scratch. And that would be really cool because you'd have something unique and it wouldn't be as signatured and all these things. But that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and might not be practical for every situation. And so one thing that I find really useful is just sort of taking these publicly available payloads and modifying them to have new functionality or to remove functionality I'm not going to use. So, excuse me. So as an example, the Atlas payload, which we're going to use today, is a C# payload, and it is, I think, their simplest one that's publicly available. So it's nice because it has a very small code base to go through to understand it. And you can kind of see some of these method implementations, such as print working directory and change directory, how simple these really are. All you're doing is passing whatever, output text you'd like into this job.response variable, and then you're setting job.completed to true. And once you do that, the next time that it checks in, it's going to send that data back. And so whatever text gets returned, at least in the first case, by directory.getCurrentDirectory, will just be shipped back as text and will show up in the operator's command line. The second example for CD has a little bit more, code to it, right? You're passing in the job.parameters variable, which is just anything you pass after the command CD gets passed to this variable. It's going to check if it exists. If so, it's going to just change the directory of the program and then return sort of a message that tells them that it was successful. But you can see, like, this isn't overly complex code. And so if you wanted to take Atlas and fork it and add new methods or remove things you didn't plan on using, it's pretty straightforward to get started with. There's not like a ton of
the output,
abstraction.
Kyle, the output of these functions and stuff ends up in ultimately in the React interface, right?
Exactly.
Gotcha. That's cool because that saves you from writing a whole bunch of code and just focusing on the actual payload functionality.
Exactly. And so you don't have to be a web developer and an API developer and a systems programmer to write a C2 framework now.
Right.
You just have to know how to make the payload. Or if you prefer, maybe you want to use an existing payload and you just want to write a network interface. But all that being said, you can just write one piece and use the framework in a new way, which is kind of cool.
Nice.
So in addition to the agent code there's also these Python scripts that we've been talking about. And so the core file in all payload types is this builder.py. And this is where you define how the payload is built and also what options need to be provided by the web interface. And so you can see here, I screenshotted a couple of options for Atlas. On the left, this is where you choose which .NET framework version to use, whether 4, which is sort of associated with Windows 10 era, and 3.5, which is associated with Windows 7 era. So you sort of choose this with a dropdown. On the right, this is like the chunk size for how big of a portion of files to send back and forth at a time if you're transferring things. And this is like a string input. So you can see between these two things, you could basically take in any data from the user. Do I want to drop down where I sort of force their hand, or do I want to just take any arbitrary data here and try and use it? And so it's pretty easy to define these. You just sort of, add to this array of things, and now you've got more options. So
that's really cool.
I've actually forked Atlas, and so I have this branch of it called CEX, and this is where I take ConfuserX, which is an open source .NET obfuscation tool, and I've added this as an option. So you can see on the right, I've got obfuscate as like a dropdown, true or false, and if you put true, it will build the payload and then run it through the obfuscator in that same Docker container. And on the left, you can kind of see the code that I implemented to do that. Basically, it's parsing this sort of definition file. And then the core of it is it's going to run confuser.cli, targeting that template file, which gives it all the options that it needs. So with this, I've added, like 20 lines or less.
Did you have to modify the Docker config to build the container to have the confuser built into the container, or does it?
I did not. All I did was I took ConfuserX and I put it in with the agent code.
Okay, gotcha.
And that gets like copied in or mounted in, I'm not sure, into the container.
Gotcha.
So that it can access all that.
So they even abstracted some of the container building away as well.
Oh, yeah. So most of the container building, you don't touch at all. You'll see, I think a little bit later, they've got this Mythic CLI binary that's made to sort of control the state of containers. So you're not ever using like Docker commands. You occasionally, like if you're building a new payload, you will have to define a Docker file, but they have Docker file templates. So you use like the Python or the C# or the Golang Mythic Docker template. You basically just say from that, and that's about all you need most of the time.
Oh,
and
I
so
see. Yeah, I saw some of that in their
work is
GitHub. Yeah, they've kind of abstracted, so you don't have to do all the heavy lifting of building your Docker
Exactly.
containers from scratch. Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah, so that's really convenient too, because, again, why should you have to know how to use Docker to write a malware payload? Like, those are sort of unrelated things, and while they are necessary, it'd be nice if it could be abstracted for you. Okay, so with this, let me go ahead and show you kind of how this ConfuserX thing works. I've got my fork of Atlas in here. So when you want to create a payload, you go to the top here where it says create components and create a payload. And the first thing is it's going to ask you to select an OS, which we only have payloads that support Windows imported, so it's only going to give us Windows as an option. We then select the C2 profile. I've got sort of a hard-coded options here, so I don't have to set them all, but here's where you can set like the IP and the port and some encryption options, as well as modify like how the network traffic is going to look.
Mm-hmm.
The HTTP profile doesn't give you a ton of options, but they also have this dynamic HTTP, which is more like the traditional malleable HTTP profile. But that is not supported by Atlas. So we're just going to go ahead and use those. I'm going to pick Atlas as the payload type, and this is where you get those options that are defined in builder.py.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see here I've got obfuscate payload with ConfuserX now as an option. I'm going to leave that as true. I can choose if I want an exe or shellcode. For now, I'll just do an exe. And then I'll just call this like Atlas cx.exe. And once I hit next, this is sort of an interesting bit. I kind of touched on this. Atlas doesn't support this, but other payloads such as Apollo for Windows do. This is where you can actually select which commands you want to include in the implant. And it uses sort of compiler directives to literally comment out code that you don't want. And so your implant is smaller if you deselect things, which is kind of cool.
That's slick.
But I hit create here, and I'm going to get some sort of status notifications that it's being created. I can click here to go to the payload management page, and you can see it being generated. These are a couple I was doing earlier to sort of make sure it all worked. But so here's my new payload, Atlas CX. And if I download this, it's probably going to get flagged by Defender just based on the assembly info and things.
So wait, Kyle, you didn't have to write any JavaScript for the React interface. It takes care of all that for you.
I have written no JavaScript.
Yeah.
Only those Python things. Yeah. As long as I've been working with Mythic, I have never written. I say as long, it hasn't been that long, but all the stuff that I've been doing, I've never had to write JavaScript. So.
Don't jinx it.
Yep, we're happy. We're happy about that.
But yeah, so this is where now you can just download this, or as you'll see, you can sort of use this in other functions in the web interface. So this is where like wrapper payloads will come in later. But let me go ahead. I'll try and download this. If it gets flagged, I'll just disable Defender. But later we'll have a payload that we do not have to disable Defender for.
Even better.
I could find my downloads window. Okay. Here's my downloads. I've got Atlas CX. I'll get the smart screen. That's okay. Well, maybe. All right, let's jump to active callbacks. And look at that. We got a callback. So
nice.
I guess the ConfuserX was plenty to get that past Defender, which that alone is like a pretty convenient feature.
Yeah.
That now you're not doing this obfuscation locally. It's just, one less thing you got to deal with. But so you can see, this is like your traditional sort of C2 looking interface. You've got some information here. I can click here and I've got my sort of, shell like interface where I could type PWD if I wanted. And it's going to check in every 10 seconds is how I have it configured. And then we'll get that information.
So now we're building a botnet. Yay.
And so there you go. I'm in my downloads.
What do you see as some of the downfalls or gaps that Mythic has in comparison to some of the other C2?
Sure. Yeah. So especially when I compare it to something like, Cobalt Strike or, a very mature framework like that, the Mythic agents that are publicly available, like Atlas and Apollo for Windows, are not really meant to be, I guess, OPSEC safe is kind of the best way to say it. They weren't really developed to be usable implants for, covert operations. They're meant to be sort of proof of concept things mostly so that you can go develop your own based on them. And so the usability out of the box of Mythic is a lot lower than other frameworks, I would say.
with some of the customizations, though, you can change that obviously and get things like the execute assembly, handoff, process injections for other beacons or callbacks or other implants, right? Just like any other C2 is all dependent on the customization.
And to be fair, like Apollo in particular has all of that capability. Like, and I mean, Atlas has a lot of it as well. Atlas will execute .NET assemblies. Apollo will also do that. It has injection. It has quite a few features just like that. It's just they're not really written to be difficult to detect necessarily. They're written to work consistently and to give the operator a lot of like understanding of what they're doing. It is kind of their goal so that they can use it as a reference. But they do have fully featured implants that do work in a lot of environments. And it's not something that like is unusable by any means. They're extremely stable and they have tons of features. It's just if you're going up against, in like sufficiently advanced blue team or even security products, you're more likely to get caught with those than you are other things probably. All right, so jumping back in, let's talk about wrapper payloads. I've kind of hinted at this a couple times, so let's just talk about what these are. So wrapper payloads, at least as far as I know, are a feature unique to Mythic. I don't think there's other frameworks that really do this. The closest thing is maybe Artifact Kit in Cobalt Strike is kind of like this, but I think wrapper payloads, like as a concept, are unique. So wrapper payloads are built just like normal payloads. You have to have agent code, you have to have builder.py. The only difference is that they take an input file from Mythic. So you give it another payload as input. And so as we saw, a payload is just an arbitrary file. So it's not necessarily an executable like we saw. It could be shellcode. It could be a script. It could be a picture. It's whatever you define, really. But typically, it's going to be an executable or shellcode. And so I made this like very generic flowchart, and then I've got a more specific one on the next page. But basically, your payload type container on the far left will build a payload and output this shellcode or executable, probably. That will be used as input for a wrapper payload. This wrapper payload does something with that file and then outputs another file. And so that's very vague, and it's kind of vague on purpose so that you can do a lot with it.
Well, it's really just like nested payloads, right? Like you have
it could be.
a Python,
you don't have to put the payload in the final result, though, right? You just have to. You don't have to use it, but the intention is you take that payload in and you do something with it, and then you output something different. Right. You could have wrapped it. You could have pulled something out of it. You could have done anything with the input file. But yeah, a lot of times it's going to be wrapped shellcode in some way.
Right.
So their example, and I think the only public example before mine, was a service binary wrapper. So you would give it shellcode from Atlas or Apollo, and it would give you a binary that could be used for a Windows service target. So you could replace the binary of an existing target, of an existing service, or make your own service for persistence, or maybe a PS exec type lateral movement or something. But one way or another, you're going to wrap this shellcode in a service binary. And now you have this new file that isn't just a normal executable. It's a service, and it calls that shellcode. But to sort of extend that, right, I've written this tool. It's called Scarecrow Wrapper. If you're not familiar with Scarecrow, this is not a tool that I wrote itself. I just wrote this for Wrapper. There's a guy, Tylus, on Twitter. His name's Matt, and he wrote this sort of implant generation tool, or implant loader tool, really. And what it does is it's going to output an executable of some sort that wraps shellcode. So they come up with some kind of Golang payload. It can be an exe, a DLL, an Excel file, an MSI, a CPL, and it's going to output this and do all of these kind of evasion techniques to try and bypass and unhook EDR. And I know a lot of testers who this is like their primary shellcode loader that they use pretty effectively. And so it's definitely an effective payload. And so Scarecrow is great, except to use it, you have to generate shellcode in Cobalt Strike or whatever framework you're using. You have to download that shellcode file. You have to download Scarecrow. You've got to build it and make sure that you have all the dependencies and things correctly. You've got to remember all the command line flags for Scarecrow, or you've got to read the README. And not to say that that's like impossible, right? That's a lot of what I do is remembering how to use tools and installing them and things. But it's just one more step for an operator that some people just maybe don't have the time to do if they're time boxed on an engagement, or maybe they want to try a few different tools and it's sort of inefficient for them to keep downloading new ones if they have one that works, and so they may never even try Scarecrow if they have another one that they like. So
yeah, but also a manual process like that is error prone. So
of course, yeah, and you can make mistakes. You might have some weird version issue that breaks the payload. Like there's a lot of issues that you can have. So what I've done is I've made this wrapper payload that basically you build Atlas and you output a shellcode. So instead of exe like we'd select shellcode. You go to the Scarecrow wrapper generation page, you target that shellcode, you choose the options out of drop-down menus, and then it just gives you this executable in the web browser. You haven't downloaded anything yet, you haven't installed anything, this is all happening server-side, even the payloads are stored server-side, so you're not touching anything on your local machine yet. And so if this is like a group type engagement where you have multiple operators working, they can see everything that's happening there, they can all download the same file, and there's no like weird, oh, hey, can you generate a new payload for this because I can't get it working? Or, oh, can you use Scarecrow because I've never used that? It's all in the web browser and it's all happening server side, which is really nice. So let's jump into that real quick. So if I go back to payloads here, I guess payload creation, this is the successful output from that. If I go back a page, I've still got all the same options selected from before, which is kind of a convenient feature of this build page. And now I can just select shellcode instead of WinExe. And we'll just call this Atlas SC. And I'll make the extension .bin just to be clear. We can't deselect anything here, so we'll just click create. So that'll start creating. And if we go to the payload management page, we can wait for this here for a second. All right, once that is done, we jump to create wrapper now instead of create payload. So create wrapper. We're going to select Scarecrow wrapper. It's the only one added. And this is where we've got a bunch of options that Scarecrow supports. And it's essentially going to just pass these to the Scarecrow tool in that Docker container. And so you don't have to worry about knowing the options or what they do because it's all right here for you. And so we'll do the control file. Sure, we can patch ETW. We don't necessarily need console output. We can't use sandbox in this case because I'm not domain joined. This is only for DLL payloads. And then for a website, we can just do kyleavery.com. And so I'll do next. We'll target the atlas.sc.bin, which is the one I just created. We'll call this atlas-scarecrow.cpl, which is the control file extension. And we'll go ahead and create that. So let me jump back here. We'll let this create now. Roll. But yeah, so once this is ready to go, we can go ahead and download here. Go back to our downloads. We've got atlas-scarecrow.cpl. It's this control panel item format. We go ahead and double click this. We're going to get smart screen because we just downloaded it. We'll go ahead and run it though. And then we'll come back here. And if we jump back to our callbacks, we've got a new callback, callback 3 in this case, that again, same kind of process, but now we've got this payload that not only was the .NET assembly obfuscated to begin with, so all the method names and things have been changed, but then on top of that, we've wrapped it in Scarecrow to give us this sort of payload that unhooks things and makes it very difficult for security products to monitor in the first place. And then theoretically, even if they did find some piece of our payload, it's been modified from the original. So you can see how, I'm using sort of two different sort of add-ons, I guess. I'm putting Diffuser X and then Scarecrow, but theoretically you could chain as many things as you could imagine here. You could have wrappers that obfuscate it in different ways, or that maybe, pad or change the shellcode output, or you could have wrappers that, to give you different stage 0 loader options for different alternatives to Scarecrow. And so, I don't know, I think it's pretty awesome that you can sit here and all in the web interface create all these things, and you're not, worrying about all these dependencies. So, like I said, wrapper payloads, they don't necessarily give you any new ability as an operator. They just sort of streamline things. So we talked about obfuscating payloads. You could use this for generating, maybe malicious documents for initial access, right? And there are Python libraries for creating Excel and Word documents, and you could use those to create, new documents that have macros that call the wrapped payloads. You could even potentially, because these Docker containers have network access, you could call some external build pipeline. You could take whatever input file, push it somewhere totally different to another system, to a CI/CD pipeline, whatever you want. You could push them there, have it run some process, and then, use an API to pull whatever the result is back. And so you've got endless possibility really with these wrapper payloads, because as you kind of saw in that first diagram, it's just so arbitrary. Like, it's just take in a file, do something with it, give back a new file. And you can define this all in Python. So there's really like endless possibilities there.
You've been having a lot of late night conversations with Joff, haven't you?
Yeah, no, I definitely talked to Joff a lot about Mythic. And I think he's probably tired of me telling him about it by now. But
that's why he didn't want to show up tonight.
Right. I was wondering if he'd be here. I figured he'd be chuckling if he heard me talking about this.
Yeah, that build pipeline, he has all of that for offensive tools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So real quick, I'm kind of cutting close on time, so I'll just sort of breeze over this a little bit. But Terraform, if you're not familiar, is not related to Mythic. It's just a tool for defining infrastructure as code. And you sort of like define VMs and other resources, and you tell Terraform to go build it all. And so Terraform, some people will sort of cringe at me saying to use the SSH provider because they prefer something like Ansible. But in the case of Mythic, this really is kind of practical because of how simple Mythic deployment is. You can see here, this is really all that's needed to deploy Mythic. I'm installing Docker. I'm cloning the Mythic repo. I use that Mythic CLI binary I mentioned to install 3 payloads from GitHub, the Atlas, Apollo, and HTTP payloads. You could also, instead of GitHub, specify a folder, though, if you had a private repo. I define the credentials and the operation name I want to use, and then I just start Mythic. And it is a Docker Compose setup. You saw I had to install Compose as well. It's a Docker Compose setup, so there's really like nothing you have to install from a dependency perspective besides Docker and Docker Compose, which makes it really convenient to automate deploying this. Like, you're not worrying about, Dockerizing it or trying to find ways to wrap it in a way that automates it. You've already got that all done for you just by design. So that's pretty.
I will say, nice. I think independent of what Linux distro you're using, make sure you install Docker from their official repos. And
that's
not,
key.
Yeah, not using what's in the Linux distros because it's typically outdated.
For Debian in particular, this does not work. Like, you have to add the Docker repos.
Yeah, and Docker and Docker Compose are 2 separate installs that you got to do separately. And like you said, Kyle, Debian or Ubuntu, you don't use what the package maintainers include.
No, that's a really good point. I sort of left that out just for brevity's sake, but that's absolutely true.
Yeah, otherwise you get people basically hitting the same problems we hit because they're like, oh, it's included with the Linux distro. Cool, it saves me time. But no, now it's 3 times longer because now you have to uninstall it and reinstall it from the Docker repos. Yeah. Been there.
Oh yeah, definitely been there. Yep. So, barring that hiccup, it's a pretty simple process. But yeah, installing Docker sometimes can be annoying. On top of that, Mythic, the web UI is actually just a REST API to add on to this sort of idea that they architected really well, right? The React interface is actually just hitting a REST API and pulling the data. And so you can actually write scripts that hit this same API to do anything you can do in the web interface. There's no functionality that is in the web interface that you can't interact with the API for. And on top of that, the Mythic project actually provides a Python library, which I'm using in that screenshot on the right, to sort of simplify script writing. So you can see I've got this, mythic.login function now, and I've got mythic rest.payload where I can sort of define a payload and then later say generate and download it. And so this becomes really convenient from an automation perspective as well.
Kyle,
because
they give you a Python library that interacts with their API, and that's the same API used by the React interface.
Correct.
Sweet.
And
how about that for your hipster technology, Tyler?
Definitely.
Tyler's
so you can
crap.
pip install Mythic, and you've got this available to you now, which is kind of cool.
It's awesome.
But so like I said, I'm going to sort of brush past that. All right, so this is my final section, is talking. I've got 3 use cases that I think Mythic in particular is posed to sort of solve or be a better solution for. So the first one And this is something that I've heard from a lot of different testers at different places, is that Cobalt Strike is great and it has a ton of functionality, and it's just a really stable, solid tool. And because of that, there are actual threat actors using Cobalt Strike more and more and more, right? Half of the ransomware, or probably more of the ransomware things we hear about these days, are using Cobalt Strike. They've got cracked copies of it, and they're doing. And so security companies, all these EDR vendors and antivirus vendors, are disproportionately incentivized to detect Cobalt Strike. So they're investing a lot more money and time and resources into that than they are necessarily detecting, techniques. Not to say that they don't detect techniques; they absolutely do, but they're especially focusing efforts on detecting Cobalt Strike as often as possible. And so many companies have started looking at how they might make their own C2. They look at the available open source C2 options, and there aren't really a lot of things that are comparable to Cobalt Strike out of the box. Even Mythic, right? I mentioned that the payloads themselves are not as OPSEC sound as something like Cobalt Strike would be. And so out of the box, there just really isn't anything that is directly comparable to Cobalt Strike yet, especially not for free, but even paid that I know of. And so when companies look at this, though, they get in this sort of like problem where developing something that replaces Cobalt Strike costs a lot of money. You've got to have developers that can write APIs, that can write a user interface in some form, and can perform some systems programming to have some implant that interacts with API calls and things, right? So Mythic is, and I think this was the original intention, it is designed to solve this exact problem, in that it allows you to reuse the user interface and the API and even the HTTP and other network profiles and just develop a payload, which is still a sort of daunting task, right? But it's 1/3 of the task. Well, maybe not exactly 1/3, but it is a much smaller task than the three things combined, right? So now all you have to do is write one payload. They have docs that are specifically telling you how to write payloads for Mythic. They've got several example payloads in all these different languages for a bunch of different operating systems. And so that is like, I think their primary intended use case is that it really does solve this problem, hopefully, for organizations. Use case 2, and this is what I just wrote a blog post about, is the ability to have multiple stages of malware. Like you have a stage 1 implant for initial reconnaissance. You've got a stage 2, a fully featured implant. You've got maybe your stage 0 loader like Scarecrow. And it's nice because you can use Mythic to put all of that in one place. So you can generate fully featured implants. You can generate stage 1 implants. You can wrap those in shellcode loaders. And once these implants start calling back, they can all be sort of managed in the same web interface. So in this diagram here, you can see I've got these 2 different pieces of malware running on the same computer, stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 1 calls back through CDNA, let's say it's Azure, and that goes back to port 443, and we configure Azure to redirect that to port 9002 on the C2 server. And with stage 2, we do the same thing. We've got a totally different payload, and it communicates to a totally different CDN, say AWS, still over port 443, still with SSL, but then we instruct AWS to redirect that traffic to port 9004, something different. And so the Mythic core server, or at least that HTTP profile, can receive both sets of traffic and can differentiate them. But from like an IR team perspective, or from someone on the blue team looking at that computer, they look like totally different pieces of software calling back to different domains and IPs and using even maybe different network type protocols. So practically, these are totally different, implants entirely with potentially totally different backends. And so seemingly unrelated things are really being managed by operators in the same place, which is really convenient, I think, compared to sort of having multiple interfaces and, having to know 2 different tools or something.
This also has multi-operator interfaces, right? Where multiple operators can operate from the same Mythic server. One of the caveat other ones.
So you can have multiple operators with different permissions level, like admin and normal user, and you can actually have multiple operations running. So you can have 2 different operations that have their own implants associated with them and their own payloads generated and their own user accounts. So theoretically, you could run one Mythic server and have 2 different engagements running on it, and the operators wouldn't even know about each other, which is kind of cool as well from sort of an infrastructure perspective, maybe.
2 different operators pick up 2 different payphones and get sucked out of the matrix? Is that
exactly? So finally, and this is kind of what we mostly talked about today, so it's quick, is just this ability to use all of these different tools and frameworks for modifying payloads in one place, right? You don't need your Scarecrow and your Confuser X and whatever else you decide to use all downloaded on every operator's computer anymore. You just put them all in the server side and you deploy it for them, and now they can go and use all the tools they want without installing anything or even knowing how to install them necessarily. So,
well, and it's a great point, because you've got multiple folks at BHIS that are kind of renowned, Joff and someone else whose name escapes me, that create their own payloads, and rather than managing it separately, they put them in this framework and you're off to the races.
Exactly. So like as it stands, right, if you develop a payload at any place, you've got to sort of like distribute it to people. You've got to teach them how to use it. You got to do all these things. Not anymore, right? Now you put it in here, you slap the React options there, and now when they go to log into their operator panel, they've just got drop downs and things, and suddenly they're using Joff or whoever else's payload without even knowing how it works or how to use it or anything really, which is sort of that I guess force multiplier of the team now, is you can have people developing components and helping everyone.
That's really cool.
So yeah, that's pretty much what I've got for Mythic. That was all I hope to convey today. So hopefully you guys enjoyed and maybe learned some stuff about it.
Oh man,
that's really
that was pretty awesome, man.
I mean, you must have fun teaching folks how to use this. I mean, I could see a lab in a class where you got one Mythic server just going to town on your targets.
Yeah, so in my Windows PostX class that I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to start using Mythic now. Previously, we used something else, and since learning about Mythic, I've switched it over entirely. And so everyone that joins is going to get to learn to use Mythic, and even like modify some existing payloads and things like that. So it should be a fun time.
Have you thought about incorporating, training, doing some blue team training, trying to see what you're doing?
Sure. So I mean, my specialty is definitely not in the blue team area, and so I definitely try and learn all that I can about it, especially with some of the like really skilled people in that area we have at Black Hills. But I don't think I'm nearly qualified to sort of teach anyone about defense or blue teaming at all at this point. But yeah, I think that's definitely a totally different, interesting topic that maybe one day I could teach people about. But
cool.
Yeah, it'd be pretty cool to extend the framework to automate some breach and attack simulation. I know it wasn't designed for that, but it certainly seems extensible enough and robust enough to be able to do that.
And one thing Mythic does do that I didn't really cover is any command you build into a payload, you can actually assign it attack IDs for the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And at the end of an engagement, you can actually pull up this sort of map that highlights which attack IDs you used on the engagement, which is a really cool tool to show clients and for them to even take back to their security vendors and say, hey, you caught these ones, but not these ones. What's going on? You know?
So wait, are you mapping it to legit attack IDs, or are you using it as a deception technique?
Or legitimate attack IDs. So anytime you execute a command, if the implant has been written to support this, which a lot of the public implants have, in the framework, like in that web interface, it will sort of make a note that you use this technique or this attack technique at this time, and this was the command you ran. And at the end, you can sort of export this report that if you want to, you could give to the blue team or to a client.
Kyle, other than training, do you have any webcast or any other things coming up at BHIS?
Nothing is scheduled at the moment. I just did a webcast, I guess, like a month ago. But otherwise, I'm kind of just focusing on some personal projects and things after this.
It's awesome. Kyle, are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Oh, yeah, I guess so.
There's no right or wrong answer, and we asked these questions, same questions of all new guests on our show. So, Kyle, 3 words to describe yourself.
Oh, geez.
That's 2. Oh, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
I guess I would say that I'm passionate, and I'm learning and I guess excited. Like this is just stuff I like to do, and I'm always trying to learn more.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Ooh. I think you got to go with the ice knife, right? Or that's like the classic.
Icicle, that's classic. Yes. If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Oh, geez, wouldn't be much to talk about. What would a book about me be called? Something with short story in the title, because like I said, I'm still pretty young, not a whole lot to write a book about.
Kyle, what is your favorite hacker movie?
It's got to be Hackers.
There you go.
That's definitely
All right.
a great
Vote
one.
for the Hackers Camp. Jeff, he's not here tonight, but we have this kind of running game where I'm in the Hackers Camp. He's in the Sneakers Camp. I like sneakers. I just think Hackers is my number one choice, so I'm with you.
Hackers is great. Yeah.
Kyle, choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fiction, or otherwise.
Gotta be Keanu Reeves, just because The Matrix. Let's see. Other parent? Maybe Trinity, just to keep it sort of in the same theme.
All right.
There you go. Use the term operator a lot, so I can tell you're a big fan. Although I think that movie came out before you were born, but
maybe I don't know what year it came out, but I did grow up watching that.
It was 99. I believe it was 1990. Was it 99? Was The Matrix 99?
I was alive in 1999.
Barely.
Yes.
Hold on. Now I got to look that up and see if I was
1999.
Right. It was 1999. There you go.
Fun fact: I might be in the background of Matrix 4. I was in San Francisco when they were filming part of it, and we were sort of in the back when they had a whole scene going on. I didn't realize it at the time, but
that's awesome.
Come to find
so
out,
you might be an extra. That's
there's
amazing.
a chance.
An extra.
An extra.
Yeah.
Sweet. Kyle, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Yeah, thank you guys. It was great to be here.
Coming up next, the security news. Stay tuned.
Qomplx has brought together vulnerability management and patch management, letting security teams discover vulnerabilities and apply patches immediately, all within a single, unified app. Sign up for a free trial of Qomplx VMDR, vulnerability management, detection, and response today at securityweekly.com/Qomplx. Cybercriminals are using social engineering, loaded with urgency and fear, to successfully prey on victims, your employees, or your customers. Protect your Office 365 email from today's most sophisticated attacks with Barracuda Email Threat Scanner. It's a free tool to help protect your business from these hard-to-detect attacks. The Barracuda Email Threat Scanner uses artificial intelligence to hunt and eliminate Office 365 email threats. Find the cybersecurity threats hiding in your Office 365 email right now. Get your free email threat scan at securityweekly.com/Barracuda.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Cyber Risk Alliance, in partnership with InfraGard, has launched the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Benchmark Study. Measure your readiness for ransomware by completing the survey and getting your score by visiting securityweekly.com/CIRB. Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through the 8th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. We're excited to announce our first round of speakers, which includes David Kennedy, Alyssa Miller, O'Shea Bowens, Maria Chiavata, Patrick Coble, Chris Eng, Eric Escobar, Kevin Johnson, and Justin Kohler. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked. Register today and check out the Rockstar lineup. And now, the security news. Where do we want to start, gentlemen?
At the beginning?
This wasn't I don't know. It's an interesting week. It was different.
It was like slow coming out of DEF CON, Black Hat
like,
type of stuff.
Lately, I've been trying to, like, when I go through my roughly 15 to 20-ish stories, I kind of assign them to the host or on the show, right? Especially if it falls outside of my area of expertise, or I just didn't get time to read it. I've been trying to be good about, like, sending it to you folks. Like, this week, there wasn't, like, a whole lot to go around.
Yeah.
Like, it was kind of like Accenture was ransomware. Like, okay, we get it. Microsoft released a patch for Print Nightmare or whatever. Is it Print Nightmare? Again. I guess we should start there, because when I saw that headline, I was basically like, the analysis is Microsoft released the patch, someone was waiting, like had all your tools loaded, and got the patch, reverse engineered it, and was like, there's another flaw, right? Which, I mean, we've seen time and time again. That was kind of my assessment of that one. Would you folks agree?
Yeah.
Pretty much, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's par for the course, basically, right? I mean, and we established on previous shows that it's kind of it's antiquated code. You know, printer code's been around for a long time, and it's just like one of those, like, multifaceted kind of vulnerabilities that people are going to take advantage of.
So my understanding on the new patch is they instead of making it an option to make it admin required to install printer drivers, it's now they're forcing the issue. That's the big thing, because that was like if you applied the first patch and didn't set that registry key, it really didn't fix it. And with that, it solves the root problem of being able to arbitrarily install drivers or files in those directories.
I did see that. So recap that for me again. If you're a non-admin user, you can't install a printer driver? Is that
correct?
I got
you have to have
under certain conditions.
Permission.
What conditions are you speaking of, Tyler?
So the condition, there's a flag with inside of that is the must be admin to install printer, or easy print, I think is what it's called. But that function with inside of the print spooler is what was the vulnerable piece that could allow you to connect to a remote printer, have it install the printer, double click it, and then that installs the driver as system, which is your DLL if you control the print server.
I see, because we talked about that attack vector, that to make it easy to print, Windows historically just installs the driver. Linux does that as well, right? Like, it goes out and discovers printers and just installs the driver.
Yeah, what are we going to call it when, we can do this on Linux? It's not like a nightmare at that point. It's I don't know.
Yeah.
Bad trip to the psych ward.
But I mean, you could say like how many people use Linux to print, but it's largely automated, just like it is in Windows. And I'm sure Mac OS has the same thing because they want to make it easy for the users. They're probably automatically installing drivers as well. I mean, I don't think this is a operating system dependent kind of function. It's a historical thing. Printers suck to deal with. Tyler, I think given your background, you could probably really attest to that, right? And we want to make it as easy as possible to just make stuff work because it's the bane of our existence if you've worked in IT for any amount of time and tried to allow people to print, right? I don't know. I don't even know if it's less and less today. Like, people still need to print.
Yeah, that's why the print spooler has always been there. It always is going to be there. And there's that backwards compatibility. It's one of those things that they can't just take out of an operating system or re-architect. It's been integrated for so long as legacy code. Like, printing is a core function of business. Like, regardless of what you think of printing and digital, right now you talk about law offices, you talk about medical offices. Everything is still ran on paper. Anything that's contract based is still largely paper based. And
and interesting too, a lot of the like COVID forms you need, those of us that have kids in school and or camps, I found I've had to print. And what's kind of scary is I print from my phone. I have this Canon app on my phone that I'm highly skeptical, but I'm like, it's kind of convenient to just, I'm on my phone, I got the email, and I want to print the attachment because I got to fill out this form so my kid can go to camp kind of thing. To kind of bring that down to reality where many of us are.
There was one of the Orange County Choppers memes that I saw the other day, and I wish I could find it. I just looked for it and I can't find it. It was along the lines of senior saying, "I can't print," and his son saying, "The print spooler's off." Yeah. and well, turn it back on. Microsoft hasn't patched it in a month. I can't even print the PDF. Like, I can't even print a PDF? God damn it. I'm out of here.
Yeah, because as we talked about, that's still the spooler functionality.
Exactly.
And that's just the spooler side of this, right? Like there's 4 other different kind of nightmares that are happening between Nightmare Hive and the different RPC commands that you can use to leverage any number of the vulnerabilities, plus the new one that was released at Black Hat on the Kaz Exchange servers. Like, there's a ton of vulnerabilities right now that are being publicly exploited or remotely exploited, whether you're inside or outside the environment.
Oh, I want to talk about DCE RPC. Did you guys see my story number 9 from HD Moore? Wrote a blog post.
Ooh.
If you haven't read this, you got to read this from top to bottom.
I saw this and I didn't get it. Okay. Right. Like, I
mean, most of us know HD personally and knows he's like one of the nicest people in the world, let alone security, right? But also he's writing very, very well. Like, it is. We read a lot of articles for this show. This article is very well written, and I read it from top to bottom. And to summarize, basically, Windows TCP port 135 is DCE RPC, very similar, if not very much the same as a Unix or Linux RPC, remote procedure call system. So HD's goal was to so HD does Rumble. I think one of the most accurate and complete network fingerprinting tools available. And I tell you, in my testing, I use that as the standard to say, like, if Rumble fingerprinted it as this and found it, if something else doesn't live up to that standard, it's not worth my time. And so HG's team, he was talking about the challenge of fingerprinting Windows workstations versus servers, because the workstation, like Windows 10 versus a Windows server, it's really hard to tell the difference. And he had some heuristics that I forget the exact details, but his heuristics weren't as accurate as he wanted them to be. So he looked to DCE RPC and enumerated all of the remote procedure calls on Windows systems in his lab and was like, I want to see if I can determine, based on the RPC and DCE information coming from port 135, if there's differences in what it reports from a Windows 10 device versus a Windows Server device. And he's like, I didn't have a big enough sample set. So he scanned a portion of the internet to get a larger sample set, put it in an Excel spreadsheet, and basically did a bunch of analytics to determine that for certain operating systems, they will respond in a certain way. Basically was able to go read the post, right? You can see his methodology. I know he basically used his original heuristics coupled with the analytics from DCE RPC to make a better determination whether that was a workstation or a server. But then like bonus, which I think is one of the coolest things, like that's cool in and of itself. But the bonus was he can determine based on RPC information if the host has a Wi-Fi adapter and what type it is, and some AV software also reports through the DCE RPC process, so he could tell which AV software is running. I mean, that's just like amazing research.
All unauthenticated, by the way. Like, this is all unauthenticated. Using the UUIDs and the comparisons, like this is getting down to even OS versions, like 1809, which is super helpful for exploitation. Yeah,
but also like you don't just get like a few artifacts back from RPC in any given host. You could get 1,000 different of the was it UUIDs you said, Tyler, right? Was the unique identifiers that are associated with like a registered service within RPC. So you get 1,000 of those just from one computer, basically. So it's like a big...
Yeah, there's a ton of results. You're basically fuzzing the RPC and doing a comparison or hash lookup on the UUID. That's a ton of work. That's a really novel way to do accurate fingerprinting without authentication.
It's awesome.
1,000 points of light.
And 12,000 systems helped him by just being exposed to the internet raw, so he could just grab them.
And good Lord, why is 135 exposed to the internet?
Was it 135
That's
or 139?
where I was heading.
135 is RPC, yeah.
Yep. Because you said 139 earlier, I thought.
Did I?
So
sorry.
maybe.
Yeah, 135 is the RPC port, yeah.
Yep.
Very similar to, really quick, Synology. Synology NAS devices. Like, why are they exposed to the internet? I mean, it's basically password spraying, right? And Synology having to come out with an advisory to their users on how to secure your device. Like, really, that's just one thing. Like, don't expose it to the internet. Like, NAS devices weren't meant to be exposed to the internet. Yeah. Why are you doing
I'm curious if they're doing...
saying don't do that?
I'm curious if they're exposing that via like UPnP as part of the setup in order to allow cloud sync and some of their other cloud native apps on the phone and the computer.
It's all for usability. It's that trade-off, right? Same thing with printers. It's all in the name of usability. Could be, in that case, Tyler, for sure. Again, why do you have UPnP in it? I mean, home users, that's a different story, right? Because the firewall will automatically just make the firewall rule for you, which is just frightening.
And anytime you update, like UPnP almost always gets turned back on.
Yes. Oh, we can talk about IoT devices in a couple of different stories.
Yeah.
Tenable researchers. I think this goes back, I think it was last week I was talking about, like, you analyze the firmware, you find the HTTP server, and you analyze that code for vulnerabilities. Tenable did just that for, I want to say this was for one Arcadian. Say that again? Arcadian. It's spelled weird.
It is.
Arcadian firmware. Thank you, Larry.
I'd like to say I was letting you struggle with it for a little bit, but I had no idea how to pronounce it either.
Yeah, your brain put those pieces together faster than mine did. Yeah, right. Arcadian, thank you, firmware. They found a path, an unauthenticated authentication bypass vulnerability.
This is your story number 2.
My story number 2, based on a path traversal. Like, basically, we've seen this in many different embedded in IoT devices where authentication is applied to a set of pages, but authentication does not apply to, they use some kind of regex or, kind of filtering to say that, like, images aren't applied to /images. Authentication's not it does not require authentication. Therefore, the attack they constructed was basically a path traversal that used images. What was the exact string? Percent to C.
Was it shortened or is it .%2?
Yeah, %2 basically was like a path traversal, so that if you put images in your URL, it would pass the checks, but your path traversal took you back to the actual management pages, so that unauthenticated you can basically manage the device, and that's what Tenable found. CVE 2021 290.
Good. Good, Lee.
The thing I was looking at it is the when you're creating authentication with a hole like that, it's actually harder to implement than to just put the ACL across the entire access.
Agreed, Lee. Like, why wouldn't you just put unless there was some kind of use case for the images to be unauthenticated? I mean, I have developed web apps where I'm like, this should be accessible without authentication, and these should. You want to make sure, I think, you have absolute paths and not relying on some kind of filter or regex, because usually that's where you run into trouble.
Right. And there's 19 manufacturers who have this stuff. And my take on some of them, these are just, the vendor provided, like your Verizon termination point from the ISP. So who knows when it's going to get updated? You can't go in there and touch it.
Right. And this is the classic problem, because as I've seen with these web management kind of frameworks and web servers for embedded systems, is that they just get recycled. Like, there's a software company in China, usually, in the past. Joel's Backdoor was the famous one that I always reference, right? But that was exactly this. There was a Taiwanese company that made the web server and web management interface, and just other people just licensed it. Because, if you're Buffalo or D-Link, I don't want to write that myself. I've got firmware that's pretty similar. Oh, hey, I can go license that from this Chinese firm, and I can just get their code and embed it in my firmware, and I'm off to the races. And that's why you see, like, the giant list of devices that this affects, because folks just reuse the code.
Yep. My question on this, and this would be a great opportunity for me to go buy one of these devices and try it out. That the initial findings and stuff were for the Arcadian routers, but there are a number of different vendors: Asus, British Telecom, Buffalo, Deutsche Telekom, Telus, Vodafone, a bunch of other manufacturers.
Same processor architecture, right?
But and the question is that what is the commonality? And to me, this seems like either web server or web server configuration. And looking at the output from the actual Tenable announcement,
there's a great Medium post in there that goes through in my description a full decomposition with source code available on this particular.
Because my question is, what's the common component? And my initial thought was, oh crap, this is a problem with BusyBox. And BusyBox is friggin' everywhere for a web server for stuff. And turns out the HTTP response, when you curl one of these things, the server is Arcadian HTTP 1.0.
Yep.
So for the Arcadian devices, did they just change the HTTP headers for their devices? Or is it a similar back-end web server that they have in common? And why didn't they just use BusyBox, which has been time-tested, proved, beaten up a billion ways to some way?
The collection of...
But BusyBox has...
GNU utilities.
Yes. Which has an HTTP web server.
Yeah, which one of the utilities you can put into BusyBox is
and has been around for years and has been used and abused on the internet and is largely...
Still going to write an application on the back end that serves up your web management interface.
But your web server and your configuration should prevent direct directory traversal.
Yeah, you can prevent that at the web server level.
This is, in my opinion, it's a web server problem. So what's the web server? Well, I got to go read your article now, Paul, on this one, because
in my description I linked to a Medium post,
and that was your store number 2.
Yep.
Yeah. In my article, there's a link to the Tenable report, which is on Medium.com, and it gets into details about how it's checking, and it is quite an interesting read.
Your link is your thing is not a link.
Yeah, my thing is not a link.
Okay.
Because my code sucks. My code should have turned that into a link. I need to go fix that.
Oh. The point isn't to throw Paul under the bus. The point is to say that's a really good read when you get to it. And
yes.
It's like, and you can say, well, damn, that they shouldn't have done that. Or like me, I could have done that and made the same mistake.
But it's really just code reuse, right? Like they basically, Buffalo, D-Link just licensed this. I'm assuming licensed. I don't think they'd give it away for free, right? They licensed this web management interface as opposed to writing it on your own.
There's a ton of, like we kind of called this again, there's a ton of vulnerabilities against external work from home routers or consumer-based routers that are being exploited. In fact, the Mirai bot, I believe, is utilizing a good portion of this. Visual Door actually was testing Visual Door yesterday against some Sonic walls, and it's a pretty slick, like these are all very, very similar in how they're doing remote code execution, or parameters are misconfigured, or CGI is not done right. Like there's a ton of things that are very similar, and it seems like it's common mistakes with inside of the CDIC pipeline or secure coding pipeline or whatever thing is being shared or these developers are outsourcing. And it seems very similar across most of these.
Because it's a really slimmed down web management interface. You know, as we talked about with Mythic, I was impressed with the design because it was a very modern architecture, right? But if you got to put that all on, you know, a firmware where your download's going to be 1.8 megabytes, you're not doing all that fancy stuff. Like you're doing old school CGI, you know, kind of stuff, and that's where mistakes are made. What else we got? Oh, if you want to like read something, Larry, that your story number 3, the Cyber Symposium. I don't like what's it called when you kind of get enamored with something and you just keep reading it, and even though it's a dumpster fire, like you got to keep reading it. Like
I think that's what it's called, exactly like that.
It's just a dumpster.
It's a time suck. I don't know.
Because you want to watch a dumpster fire because it's
there's fire.
It's fascinating.
It's in a dumpster.
It's like watching fire. Like you're just watching wood burn. And you're like, I don't know why this is so engaging.
I wonder what's in there. Is it garbage? Is it a body? Is it trash? Is it?
I bought a solo stove, and like it's just so cool to like watch the fire. And really, all it is like a stainless steel drum with like some holes in it for airflow, right? And there's a bunch of companies that make it, but like when you put wood in there and you light it on fire, it's just you're just enamored with it. Same thing with this Twitter thread. And there's a couple of Twitter threads out there.
Yeah.
That what is the crux of it? The My Pillow guy.
Yep.
Put it together a cyber symposium.
So
to talk about how Trump really won the election.
Yeah. So
right? Is that the whole crux of it?
The My Pillow guy has been claiming that
he has evidence.
He has evidence in 37 terabytes worth of data with magic cyber PCAPs. Cyber captures and PCAPs and you know all these words that he doesn't understand, to my understanding, and that they have a smoking gun to prove that China stole the election, and that he has the smoking gun to prove in this cyber data that China modified votes and so forth. And he said, I've had my cyber team look at this, and they say absolutely, China, and Trump should be back in the presidency because the election was stolen.
Yeah, but like Rob Graham and others, Rob Graham went.
So he held the cyber symposium where he said, "Yep, I'm going to give you everybody. I'm going to give all these professionals the data, and I'm going to show them the stuff, and they're going to be able to see the smoking gun too."
Didn't happen.
Oh, the cyber symposium happened,
but no evidence. What Rob reported and many others was there was still no evidence.
Yep, number of PCAPs.
No, I get
number of PCAPs disclosed.
Like if you look at how from a political perspective, right? Like the Obama administration versus the Trump administration dealt with China.
Sure,
very, very, very different. But so like you can get the theory, right? That China would have a vested interest to be like, Trump basically treats China like crap, so we don't want him in office. I get that.
We get all that.
We get all that. But then you got to come down to having like actual evidence to make
Right.
that claim, and that's just not. It's just not here.
Yeah.
Basically, I'll save you the time of reading the threads. I mean, if you like dumpster fires, you should go read it.
And you should. And
You should,
And
yeah.
quite honestly, there were a bunch of folks that came back at Rob and like, "What do you mean you weren't provided evidence? Their red team people got PCAPs." And he's like, "Oh, and we also saw this other evidence where all the security was defeated on stage." And like, no, it was a batch file that basically said, "Oh yeah, hey, disable the security so that we can run the Dominion voting system stuff without it triggering something or other, and then turn it back on after it's done." Oh, and encrypt the databases. Like, that post got deleted.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, there, a lot of conspiracy theory. And the biggest takeaway was that I've got the data. I'm going to let you take a look at it, and we're going to show you proof. And zero proof was provided.
I don't know if Neil deGrasse Tyson actually said this, or if it's just pictures kind of in the quote in the meme. But like, you can believe whatever you want to believe, but like science is still science, and I think that applies here, right? Like, if there was actual evidence, like, okay, I would take that as actual evidence, but if there isn't,
CISA would like to know.
yeah, like exactly. But that's what I come back to too. Like, CISA was actually created by Trump, which is kind of interesting. But also, we've talked about it on the show, right? Like, you got to have evidence.
Yep. If he had evidence, why didn't he turn it over to the federal authorities?
Yeah.
Who can do the analysis impartially?
Yep.
The best one that I saw was just recently. There was an article that said the head of his own cybersecurity team that allegedly said, "Oh yeah, this is here." Actually went and did a bunch of interviews with a bunch of folks and said, "Yeah, no, this stuff is a turd. Like, there's nothing here."
Right.
His own cybersecurity people.
How does MyPillow have a cybersecurity team and some of these big companies don't?
Oh, it's just
politics.
It's not
Tyler,
that
at
they have
point,
a cybersecurity team. Is that MyPillow guy went and hired these people to prove that he was right.
Yeah, and that
They don't have a cyber.
that's not a conflict,
He hired people to analyze his data. Like, it was a cybersecurity team to prove his own ends.
Interesting.
Yep. And Adrian shared this in Slack. He finally says that Rob Graham said, "All I'm saying is that when there's a PCAP fight, don't bring a pillow."
Yeah, bring PCAPs.
Yeah.
Don't even bring a MyPillow, apparently. For the record, this is not a political thing. This is about the cybers and the data and the PCAPs
right.
and
Like,
the proof.
there's evidence or there's not, right?
Yep.
That's what it comes down to.
I think.
Go ahead,
I
Lee.
think the work here has got to be done. There's some states they're auditing their elections. They're finding irregularities. They're not cyber irregularities. They're finding where people miscounted ballots or didn't clear out sample ballots, which is very different. I don't consider that to be the kind of evidence he would find.
That's not China logging in and switching votes.
That's a flesh and blood problem, not an IT problem.
Yep.
And we can't cyber around that. Not really.
So the one of the best things that I think about this whole cyber symposium thing is that at the beginning of the symposium, MyPillow guy said, "I'll give anyone who can prove me wrong that I have evidence. If anybody can prove me wrong, I'll give them $5 million." And then, okay, so nobody's proven me wrong. I'm going to take this offer off the table. Oh, and by the way, I still haven't given you the data that you asked for, or that I would promise that I would give to you. So, like, totally shady.
Crazy. Our friends Gary and Justin have filed a civil lawsuit against Dallas County Sheriff Chad Leonard for the incident that occurred in September 2019. And we had Gary and Justin on the show. And many of you are familiar with this incident, right? So the latest development is basically there's a civil lawsuit that Gary and Justin have filed against the Dallas County Sheriff Department. And it's kind of interesting, right? Like, because this is America. Anyone can sue anyone. And I'm curious where everyone kind of falls on this, right? Like, I side with the pen testers because that's, they're my people and I support our industry and I believe they were wronged. And I believe we've also heard both sides of the story on this one, and I still kind of side with our pen testers in Coalfire on this one. Of course, the Dallas County Sheriff is saying, yeah, bring it on. Like, he can sue us, they can sue us, but, it doesn't mean anything. And I'm like, really? Like, of course you're going to say that. Like, that's kind of where I'll pick a side on this one, right? I'm with the pen testers. Like, I'm sorry.
Yep.
That's just,
thoughts? I'm surprised it's taken this long.
Yeah, right?
Honestly, at the end of the day, like I have to go the other way. Like from a physical standpoint, things got messed up, and this is a risk. In fact, I mentioned this in my physical talk today for Wild West Hacking Fest. That's a risk and a risk appetite as a physical pen tester that sometimes you have to walk that gray line, and there's a lot of gray lines in physical, and that's a risk that you assume. So at the end of the day, it was a bad day. Yeah, you had some bad publicity. You had some good publicity, like your name's out there. Coalfire had some good names. Like you were in the right.
I'm going to disagree with you, Tyler, and say at the end of the day, they spent time in jail that they shouldn't have. Mm-hmm. And I think it also sets a precedent that by them filing this lawsuit, it's a statement for our community that says, like, we're not going to let this shit fly. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, whether they win or lose, I don't think that's the point. I think it's setting the precedent of, like, don't do this crap. Like, we're on the good side, and you made us the bad people, and that's not the case, right? And
so when you put it like that, I have to agree. I have to agree with you there. Like, I think that's a light that I would, and a stance that I would definitely stand behind. Like, we have to protect our pen testers. We have to protect the people doing the good work. I don't know if I would have went to civil. Like, I think.
Yeah, but like this lawsuit could go nowhere, but it makes a statement, and the statement is that, like, we're authorized to do this test, and when the waters are muddied in just a weird way that this was, we're still the good people, right? Yeah, and I think it's making that statement. Yeah,
and Lee's got to comment in there, but then I got something to say.
So I was saying I agree with you guys. I stand behind the pen testers. I mean, I'd want to make sure that their records were expunged. I don't know what the goal of the civil suit is. It's not really clear. I mean, are they trying to get compensation for spending the time in jail, or is this just the point?
No, I don't. I mean,
the point that this was just terrible.
No, I think Gary and Justin aren't looking for
the payout.
The payout. They're just looking to make a statement of, like, don't do this, right? Like setting. I think they're setting a very valid precedent that when we do have permission, even when there's like weird nuances, like, we still have permission, and also it's for the greater good. It's for the good of the security of the company. And I think that's the message they're trying to send.
Yep. Yeah. So the lawsuit alleges negligence, false arrest, abuse of process, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and malicious prosecution.
Right.
Yeah, like, basically, like, knock that shit off. Like, we're, like, that's the message it sends to me.
Prosecution against Dallas County and Sheriff Leonard after the two men showed their get-out-of-jail-free letter to Dallas County deputies, but were arrested anyways.
Right.
Like, this probably could have been solved, as we talked in the time, by a quick phone call.
Yeah.
From the letter, from the deputy to the person to get them out of bed. And it said, oh, yeah, no, they work for me.
Most of the time, that's how it happens. Like that Darknet Diaries episode where the person, the dude broke his foot and stuff. Like, they did eventually get arrested by law enforcement, showed the get out of jail free card, and they're like, you know what? The conversations with law enforcement, they were so nice to us, and they just had questions. And we were totally open, talked about our jobs, talked about the testing, talked about ways which we can improve security.
Dude, come here, watch this.
Yeah, like, talked about how we appreciate law enforcement, we respect law enforcement, we had to get a jail free card. Like, you're in the back of a cop car, and they're basically like, so tell us, like, what you do this for a living. Like, that's really cool, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's how it should be.
You break into people's places to tell them how you broke into their places.
Like, that's how it. That's how it should be. Mutual respect.
Right.
Yeah.
That's when there's not politics, and like county and state government notoriously are always at odds, especially with technology. Having worked there, like, that is a battle that is interdepartmental, not just between county and state. Like, it can get pretty vicious between election cycles and different heads of departments. So I can see how it happened. It's always nice when it doesn't happen. There's really good people there.
So much more to talk about. Super duper security mode.
Yeah, what the hell is this?
Yeah,
it's all. So this is a proposed feature. It's not an official feature.
Oh.
I do want to say, I really like Edge. I really appreciate Microsoft for their support of Linux, because Teams I mean, they're constantly doing updates for Teams, and they're constantly doing updates for Edge on Linux, which is even still today kind of like I'm like, wow, Microsoft really.
It sounds wrong to say that.
It does, but like they're really supporting Linux, and they're really huge proponents of security, as evidenced by this particular feature that they're proposing that they're calling Super Duper Security Mode, which is an Edge configuration where they disable the JIT, just-in-time compiler for JavaScript, and tying that into control flow, enforcement technology, and arbitrary code guard, right? Because basically,
the big thing is, what do those last two things mean?
I'm not an expert in those two. I can say that the just-in-time compiler, right, it's funny. It's actually similar to the way Nessus would compile bytecode of its plugins to gain a performance benefit. JavaScript works the same way, that when you have JavaScript code, your browser will actually compile that into bytecode so that it can process that faster. And by disabling that, there's a security benefit, right, in doing that. Again, I'm kind of light on the details as exactly how that works.
Sure.
But they're also, in this change, enabling some further protections for your browser. Historically, the JavaScript interpreter is the thing that vulnerability researchers like to pick on, and attackers like to pick on vulnerabilities for good reason. And this is kind of Microsoft's way to say, like, what if we went to like more extreme and put some more safeguards around the JavaScript interpreter? Which I applaud them for the efforts. I don't know if this is going to make it into the mainstream as a feature or not. I hope it does, because I think it's pretty cool. But the thing is, it's going to impact your performance in a negative manner potentially if you do this. But like the way I use Edge, I would enable this feature, which would disable the just-in-time compiler, make it slower, but make it more secure.
Yep. And now thinking about this, like two things, and then Lee, I know you want your comment here. One, that maybe this shouldn't be the super duper secure mode. Maybe this should just be secure mode.
Yeah, like advanced secure mode or something.
The regular mode is whatever their advanced secure mode is, and so forth. The other one is, it is very much now about the browsers and stuff. It's for the most part, it's not about the speed in which you get your data, which makes your browser slow. It's about how fast you can render said data and so forth. And really, is your data going to render any faster on your Core i9 processor or your Core i3 processor? Is it really, we're no longer in the time when we have to consider the order of the bytes in our packet because it needs to process them, in some other order.
Is it bytecode versus interpreted code? And what you're saying, Larry, is like with our modern processors, does that really make a difference performance-wise?
Honestly, would you notice the difference performance-wise that your web page took 0.0001 microseconds longer to load?
Most of us, I mean, all of us on the show, and most of us listening, I mean, we build systems and buy systems that are way over spec and probably wouldn't notice a difference. I think the users that are very budget conscious, that are maybe using the Chromebook or the kind of not as fast systems, basically may notice a difference.
I'd argue that
depends on if you have 1,000 tabs open or 100 tabs open.
Yeah, that's true too.
I mean, like Tyler, I'm like asking you how you know this, right? And even still, like, should 1,000 tabs make a difference on what active content that you're currently loading?
Probably not. Like there's some cool protections in disabling just-in-time compilers that eliminates a lot of some of the sandbox evasion stuff and the ability to jump code for WebSockets. Like, that's pretty cool. Like, I think I would take the speed versus security trade-off in this case, especially in a browser.
Yeah, but you and I, Tyler, that we're going to build like way more RAM and CPU into our systems than we actually need.
It's never going to
be negligible.
And I'd argue the average user wouldn't be able to tell Lee.
Yeah. So what I was going to say is that when I was reading about this earlier, the JIT is getting C++ level speed out of JavaScript, which is actually pretty impressive.
Correct.
So I could see why they should not turn it off. But something like 45% of all V8 JIT vulnerabilities are are in the JIT. I mean, it's like
Yep.
crazy amount of vulnerabilities here. So they said somewhere else, by the way, they're not going to go, if they go live, it's not going to be called super duper secure mode. They're going to give it a better name. But that's what it's called today and what is it? The Canary, Dev, and Beta versions of Edge. So you can try it out.
I like super duper secure mode.
I was kind of hoping they'd keep that name.
Yeah, right. Like I like that. I think that's cool.
But marketing is going to get a hold of it and say, what the hell?
That's really funny.
But yeah, no, I think it's a cool experiment. I'd like to see how it works out. 'Cause, I'd like to turn off the JIT other places too.
Turn that JIT off, will you?
Yes. I see what you did
Oh, that's
there.
great talk.
That's a great episode name right there. Turn that JIT off. We could go so many different places. Do we go Zoom or do we go Apple? Let's go Apple.
Yeah.
The EFF had a post. And so basically this is my story number 3. The gist of it is there are, and we've had Chris Hednagi on the show, right? Like there are horrible people in the world that are sexual predators that have to do with, pedophilia and things like that. And the way that works its way into privacy is how do you monitor communications to make sure that you can still prosecute pedophiles but still preserve people's privacy?
Mm-hmm.
It's a horrible thing to think about. Like it's just an awful thing to go to like an awful place in a very kind of somber note on this subject. Apple has a very interesting take on this, right? And so all the major technology providers, social media networks are trying to deal with this issue. Apple has a very interesting take. So they're introducing this feature. The EFF is kind of leaning towards this is a backdoor. And I totally get like their take on this, that this could be exploited and invade people's privacy. But how does someone like an Apple in this example, who has been a really great proponent of preserving people's privacy, but also allow law enforcement and folks like us to do investigations and prosecute pedophiles? Because if you give, we'll talk about end-to-end encryption, right? If you give end-to-end encryption and these technologies to everyone, they're going to be used by criminals and people like pedophiles, which is gross and disgusting. So Apple's got this feature where they can turn on this feature for family members in your Apple iCloud account that are under the age of, or 13 and under, I believe is the threshold they set, where basically like the images go through an AI engine where they're determining whether it is child pornography or not. I'm kind of behind that. Like, in that sense, I'm like, that's a really interesting.
And you can turn it on and off.
And you can turn it on and off. It's an interesting compromise, right? So, it sends a photo to another minor who does not have these features enabled. They do not receive a notification that iMessage considers their image to be explicit, or that the recipient's parent will be notified. So, like, basically, as a parent, you're notified that this is happening. The recipient's parents will be informed of the content without the sender consenting to their involvement. Once sent or received, the sexually explicit image cannot be deleted from the under 13-year-old's device. And the article goes into great detail in all different aspects. I tried to capture
this sounds a lot different than I imagined it.
Yeah.
Like I imagined it like being on my phone or my wife's phone or your phone. And you take a picture of the kid in the bathtub that's for your own personal, like, oh my gosh.
Yeah,
and
I think a parent taking a picture of a child would, because you're over 13 years of age, would not be subjected to this level of scrutiny.
Which is, in my opinion, probably the worst. We're not targeting the right market here, I would imagine.
Maybe not.
And it's not like you're taking a picture of your kid in the bathtub to be malicious and texting it to grandma.
Right.
perfectly legitimate uses for stuff like that.
Yeah, I think there'd be too many false positives with that.
And like you got the washcloth placed properly so it's not weird and that stuff. And
we've all taken pictures of our kids and had to censor them if we're going to see. You know, we've all done that. Right? We've all done that.
Yeah, I can think of one.
I mean, let's be honest. Like when they're your kids and they're running around in the comfort of your own home. Like clothing is totally optional.
I can think of one of our friends in common that posts pictures to Facebook all the time
and censors them.
And it's censored because it's no pants, no problem. We're going to play video games, no pants on. Like totally. You know exactly who I'm talking about.
His kids do not like to wear clothes, but you know that as a parent, like that happens.
That happens.
Yeah,
it happens.
But as Apple, how do you
differentiate between
that? Because there's lines here, of course.
That's got to be some crazy internal meetings to kind of weigh through some of the pros and cons.
Can you imagine, like, Tyler? That's a great point.
As a planet, like a device that affects literally millions of people. Like, what is our responsibility, and like, how do we circumnavigate that? That's.
I think the EFF, is doing their job, but I also believe that Apple's doing their job as well. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm kind of neutral on this one, right? Yeah. Like, I see both sides of it. I get the EFF wanting to protect our privacy, and I respect them for that. I also see Apple wanting to combat this problem.
And
do Tyler, to your point, like I respect them for that too. Like I know they've had these conversations and they want to solve the problem.
Yep, I think they're doing the right thing, but I think it's a really hard problem to solve. Mm-hmm. So
I'm just worried about false positives here. It seems
me too.
Like a false,
everyone is. Yeah,
a false positive on this can ruin someone's life.
And a false negative can do the same thing too.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's tricky business.
Yep.
I implore everyone to go read the article. I mean, it's a very in-depth article from the EFF, very well written. You should go read it and form your own opinions, basically. And speaking of end-to-end encryption, Zoom is paying $85 million for lying about end-to-end encryption. Like, basically, Zoom got called out for trying to redefine end-to-end encryption. And like the crux of this, like you can read the article and the quote and everything. Like basically this comes down to end-to-end encryption is Larry and I generate our own key sets and we encrypt data between each other.
Right.
That is true end-to-end.
That is
end-to-end encryption.
Nothing about true. That it is.
This is Whitfield and Diffie, right? Like in its truest sense, Larry and I have public and private keys. We exchange public keys. We encrypt each other's data. Only Larry can read the messages I send to him, and vice versa, right? Zoom kind of said, "Well, we're going to, use the keys on the server side," and thankfully now we've gotten to a point in, I think, the laws and litigation where they notice things like this and go, well, if someone compromises Zoom's servers, they can own all of the keys and get people's data. Versus if you were to do that in the previous example, you'd have to compromise Larry's machine or my machine. Mm-hmm. And if we were diligent about our key management, we would have a passphrase on our private keys. Yep. You would have to crack that as well, and or keystroke logger or whatever, right? Individual machines would have to be compromised versus one central place.
Right.
And that's basically the crux of this class action lawsuit that Zoom ended up paying $85 million to people to say,
we'll be paying.
Like, yeah, it wasn't really end-to-end
and
encryption.
Each Zoom user active during that period will receive between $15 and $25.
Yeah, not like a whole lot.
Was that money worth them shifting off of that during the COVID crisis where they had all the new inbound customers? Like, that seems probably like a small business risk decision that maybe they just had to deal with because they were trying to solve that and they were redefining
I don't know the impact.
To quote, with the pandemic boosting its video conferencing business, Zoom more than quadrupled its annual revenue from $622.7 million to $2.7 billion in the 12 months ending January 31st, 2021.
I think they regret.
Yeah, right.
They regret what how it was phrased and what they did, but it didn't impact their business. But it also set a precedent that as a company, you can't redefine what end-to-end encryption means.
Right.
And that's a positive thing. I don't want to see Zoom drag through the mud and, like end as a business. That's not, no. I think the important thing is they made it an oops. They're they're taking it as as it is. They're paying their $85 million. They're learning from it, and other people are learning from it as well. That you can't
arguably, it was a slap on the wrist.
Yeah,
exactly. 85 million out of 2.7 billion for that period. Slap on the wrist. But it's a good slap on the wrist because everybody learned.
Do you remember when Zoom was first published their white paper on how they were going to do end-to-end encryption for Zoom?
Yep.
Because I remember reading that, and it really was end-to-end encryption, and it's not what they implemented. I mean, they really had keys set by, Paul and Larry be setting and exchanging keys for their session. And then they just downshifted to TLS, because remember they were going to do it for the paid, and then they said, we'll do it for everybody for free. Well, obviously that was the compromise.
Yeah.
I don't like that they tried to redefine end-to-end, but...
Right. Yeah, the old school example is OTR. New school signal, right? Like it needs to be a true end-to-end.
Yeah.
Paul, your number 10 is very interesting to me personally.
I think his number 2 is particularly interesting. Oh, wait, no.
Oh.
It's different. Number 10.
Number 10, crypto mining botnet, modify CPU configurations.
There's a lesson to be learned here.
We need more power, Captain, right? So Qomplx, who I love as a company, they're just awesome company. And so their researchers spotted a crypto mining botnet. And basically what they were doing was there is pre-fetching in the kernel, right? Which we ended up with Spectre Meltdown, right, as some of the execution paths. But pre-fetching in this example led to, in crypto mining, a reduced performance. So what this botnet did was disable the prefetching, load the driver that does the crypto mining, disable the prefetching to be able to do the crypto mining at a higher performance level.
How did they do that though? Are they accessing this via UEFI, or are they doing this via a motherboard utility interaction with Linux, or can you configure this kernel flag with inside of the file system?
My guess would be this is a kernel driver that tells the kernel to do prefetching or not. And then the kernel handles, my guess, again, second guess, is that the kernel handles the communication with the CPU and the hardware to enable to disable that, right? Like Wheel did and you'll hear it next week. We did an interview with Wheel about the Sequoia vulnerability, kind of talked about the interfaces to the kernel, like the user land interfaces to the kernel and the kernel code, separate from the kernel drivers, separate from all the user land binaries like systemd, which is a very, very fascinating when you think about that from a security perspective, how all those things interoperate. So my guess is you can load a kernel driver that also dictates to the kernel how it should handle prefetching and end up disabling that, really independent of the architecture, because the kernel is going to handle that interface with the hardware.
That's pretty legit. Like,
yeah,
overclocking malware is like we've talked about the UEFI.
Yeah, it kind of is overclocking hardware, Tyler. That's a great way to put it.
That's pretty. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So it looks like they're using an OS level driver called the model specific register driver that will do it. So they're adding basically a driver in there at the OS level. They're not screwing around with the BIOS to disable it. Looks like it's a registry key you can hit. I'm not registry.
Right, 15% speed boost, which isn't bad.
Yeah, I don't think you can do this in Windows. Just thinking through how I operate and mess around with Windows at this level. Like, I think there are hardware interactions and protections there. Like, it doesn't work the same way with the file system. But I may be wrong.
But it's funny you say that, Tyler, because Lee and I explored that with Wheel. Like, the whole concept of Linux in allowing the user more control has, in some sense, like a more difficult job enforcing rules. Like, the whole premise of Sequoia, when you hear the interview next week, right, is the ability to create a 1 gigabyte in size directory tree. That's not files within your file system. That is a directory tree that exceeds 1 gigabyte. And I posed the question to Wheel, and you'll hear his answer, like, how do you rationalize, like, the usability versus security kind of argument where, like, what is the use case for creating a directory structure, right? And Linux errors on that side of giving the user control versus putting the protections in place. And it just really, it's a fascinating aspect. You get to hear Wheel's thoughts on that, which is it's really cool.
Yeah. That was neat.
Also neat is the glowworm attack. Did you guys see this one?
I did not see this one.
So this is in the class of things we've talked about in the past, where you can vary, for example, vary the fan speed of the fans within your computer because they emit a different harmonic frequency that can be measured by a listening device.
And arguably, they're also being controlled by PWM, which PWM and a specific speed can be used to create RF energy.
Yep.
So, okay.
Holy crap. What?
Yeah.
Like the fans can create RF energy.
Well, not the fan, the controller that tells the fan how fast to spin.
Emits RF energy.
Yes. So if we think about, so I'm going to go back to when we had Faith on the show when we talked about Vapor Trail. And Vapor Trail took a Raspberry Pi and toggled one of the GPIO pins to create RF energy radio signals. That's PWM. That's pulse width modulation. It's PWM.
Crazy.
And the fans are controlled by PWM.
Right.
And that was one of the things that we theorized is like, great, we're using a Raspberry Pi, but what if we can find something that we can use to control the PWM of the fans in a system to do the exfil that way?
So this,
moving along.
This says recovering sound by analyzing optical emanations from a device's power indicator LED. So the response of the power indicator LED. Right, the response of the power indicator LED of various devices to sound and show that there's an optical correlation between the sound that is played by the connected speakers and the intensity of the power indicator LED.
Right.
Yep, I can see that because
I mean,
go ahead, Tyler.
There were power companies that were doing this like a while back. Like they would know what you were watching on TV,
Television,
which program station, based on the power draw.
Because different colors, on the screen drew different amounts of power from your backlighting and so forth. They could tell at the power meter what shows you were watching because they would fingerprint the various scenes in the shows. You could tell, what the intensity of all the pixels were and all that type of stuff on your LED screens. So very similar. So you increase the PWM, it uses more energy, means the power light on the front of your computer dims just a little bit.
That's the gist of this one, right?
Yep.
Right.
And you could tell that the fans were changing speed audio.
This is how you get by air gap networks, and there's lots of governments that do this kind of stupid shit.
But this is like
Who has time for this?
But this is like the academic stuff that we read about now. That 10 years from now we read about in an actual attack. Right?
Tyler, go ahead, Lee.
So one of the things, though, is there are for what Tyler was describing, there are TSG disconnect devices you put in line with things like speakers and microphones that do physical disconnects and you remove a lot of this kind of hardware to make it you harden the machines from a lot of these kinds of attacks. The problem is the average person air gapping their stuff like a control system. They're not going to do all that.
Yeah. Most of this stuff, Lee, to your point, can be disabled in the BIOS. I mean, those of us that are diligent will, if I know I'm not going to use the onboard sound controller, I disable that in the BIOS, right? Because that limits my interrupts and it just makes it up for a cleaner system. If I'm not, it kind of goes back to like old school hardening. If I'm not using it, I'm going to disable it. But what you're saying in this article is also saying is like when you get down to that level, you can disable the power indicators on the LED lights, right? That indicate power. Because that could be a potential attack vector, which I think is really enlightening.
And Tyler's like, there are nation states doing these stupid things. Like, and you say, these are the academic things we read now that are going to be 10 years later.
They're definite things we have to think about. And they will carry forward.
Build the detection now. Build the detection
software,
now.
aka BIOS disablement, is not always accepted as good enough.
Yeah. I think that's where Ecliptium is really way ahead of their game, and honestly thinking through like even stuff we were working on 3 or 4 years ago, like this is where the attacks are moving to, is at hardware level of persistence, supply chain attacks, integrating into chips, finding those, knock bits or knock pins on chips, and the ability to do those. Like that's the level that we're having to deal with, and we still have people having a hard time taking away local admin. So
yeah, it's a great point.
Yep.
Pick your battles, right?
We still got people dealing with ransomware, which is my story number 13, right? In the quadruple extortion, double secret quadruple extortion.
Woo!
So we know about encryption. They're going to encrypt your data, right?
Yep.
We know about data theft.
They're going to steal it before they encrypt
They're going to steal it.
Yep.
We know about denial of service. They're going to cut off your access to the data. But now there's, I think the new one is really harassment. They contact customers, business partners, employees, and media and tell them the organization was hacked.
And that they should pay the ransom.
That's
I mean, leverage, right? Like this all goes back to the psychology of how can you gain leverage in order to get someone to do something. And I think it's going to get nastier and nastier. You start to look at some of the newer stuff where they're starting to target ESXi hosts and leverage the CLI for ESXi and just encrypt your ESXi. Like that's all of your host, and getting back up because your backups are not available to get running on ESXi again. That's a problem. Like bare metal restoration of large organizations at the virtual hypervisor level is very, very difficult.
I read an article too that would like basically kind of analyzing the whole backup strategy where, I'm resilient to ransomware because I have a backup, and basically evangelizing like attackers know this too. And they're going to go after your backups because we all
and time to recovery and feasibility of recovery from backups in most organizations, while you do have it, unless you're very, very small, that feasibility is exponentially smaller. In fact, especially if you have things like cloud or offsite, getting that data back is so slow, and or you have to wait to ship drives, and the level of data that you have may not be able to be shipped, and restoring back to something like an iSCSI vSAN that's in a mirrored mode on a VMware ESXi host cluster. Like you don't just restore from backup for something like that, or even Active Directory. Right? That just is not how that works.
I guess I don't.
That's not how any
I
of this
put my
works.
evil hat on, and I look at, like, let's say you're using a SaaS provider, right, for your backups, a cloud kind of backup thing. Like maybe I just take over that service. I reset your password. I lock you out of that service, and then I ransomware the whole environment.
So I think that's the next. I think that's the next big ransomware that I've been thinking about is taking over accounts like your Azure cloud account where Active Directory is online. You set a new two-factor and recover email, or you take over that and have a new two-factor on there. How do you get that back, and how do you start to recover from something like that?
You just remove the organization's ability to restore from backup and then do your ransomware, which I hate to
SaaS.
I hate to verbalize that, but I want people to be aware of that too, right?
Well,
SaaS and single sign-on are the two-headed dragon. Like this is a talk we've talked about a ton of times. Like this will become a problem from a ransomware standpoint just by taking over creds, and then you don't even have to ransom it. You're ransoming access at this point,
right?
Which takes a ton of the level of effort and abilities of the attacker, like down a whole notch and a whole bar.
It's kind of similar to like your SIM swapping, right? Like you're basically just pulling the rug out from underneath people. Like, I don't care what security you had. Like, if I can take over your accounts, I win. It's what it comes down to.
Yep. I have a friend that got SIM swapped and got his Bitcoin stolen. And the perpetrator got caught, and they are now having to pay restitution.
Yep.
The best part is they're not being told to be paid monetary restitution.
It's Bitcoin restitution. And if Bitcoin's higher than it was before.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
Like even
you make out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
The problem is that do you actually think someone's who's going to prison is going to be able to pay off a couple $1 million in Bitcoin?
Yeah, right. That's there was $600 million in Bitcoin that was stolen, and we had that. I think many of us had that story, right?
You did. I know
it was basically like they stole $600 million in cryptocurrency, not just Bitcoin, Monero, and others. And one of the firms was like, great, like good for you. You stole $600 million. Like you think that's not gonna draw the attention of law enforcement, like maybe you just want to give some of that back and avoid like this whole mess. And they started giving some of it back. I don't know. I read different articles that different amounts that they had to give it back in different, cryptocurrencies.
They didn't want to crash. They want to crash the currency as well. I heard there were some things about like the currency market and like what damage or price spike or drop that was going to cause. Maybe there was some external influence on identifying who these people were, and they were asked in not as nice words to consider their fate and what they're doing with the money. Like that's a pretty common thing. There's companies that do
Tyler,
digital asset recovery.
If hypothetically I steal enough Bitcoin that I can affect the market, that it's not law enforcement I'm worried about. It's hypothetically the Russian mafia that's like, yeah, hey Paul, like, yeah, no, like you're not going to crash Bitcoin because we're going to kill your family, and I just give all that back. Like that's kind of how it played out. Yeah.
Most of those don't make the news. Like digital asset recovery is a well-known market for people that play in crypto, and there's a few names that you know, and you work with these hackers to go and do asset recovery, hunt people down, find things, and you politely or impolitely utilize the leverage for whatever client you're working for to gain that money back or access back, whether that's rehacking them and or black bagging them, like depending on the country, depending on the situation, and
it's like criminals hacking criminals basically at that point to preserve the integrity of the illegitimate market. Wow, that's really interesting, Tyler. That's deep. That's deep.
Yeah.
Speaking of ransomware, Accenture, anyone? That was like you couldn't not read the news this week without learning that Accenture was ransomware, that it was Lockbit, that there was some hand waving involved, that reports are that 2,500 computers of Accenture partners and employees were compromised.
That's a high number.
There was a data dump. Unofficially,
I've been
like
looking
I've seen,
for
like there's a data dump. Like there's,
it's Lockbit 2.0. This is the Lockbit 2.0 one, right?
Yeah, this was like you could go download Accenture's data. Basically, is what I saw.
Yeah, that's kind of terrifying.
Yeah, that's kind of bad.
Yikes!
MSPs are super high risk. Like they have high visibility. I mean, we've seen this from supply chain, and we know this. But the fact that ransomware is targeting them and at such a low amount, like 50 million from a Accenture standpoint, like that's bad publicity, but that's a pretty small number given the number of contracts and companies that you actually integrate with. So I don't know. This is probably going to be another trend, is MSPs are just going to continue to be a big target, and I'm surprised it was so small.
That's scary. What else we got?
Well, I had hoped we'd have Jeff on the show because my number 2 and 3 are definitely trolling Jeff. Although I guess I fall into the number 3 of the senior citizens. I'm not affected by it. I'm in the senior citizen category where all this PII from seniors was taken.
Yeah, where was that taken from, Lee?
Wasn't it a misconfigured S3 bucket again?
Well, what was the organization that was targeted?
Was a senior advocate or senior advice?
Senior advisor.
Okay.
Financial advisor, if I remember right.
It was their leads. It was their leads for anybody turning senior, and I'm assuming they pulled that from Social Security Administration or demographic from ad tracking. With a very large amount of personal information for leads to, offer senior advice or senior advisories.
Yeah, why the article? The article states that senior citizens are at a higher risk of online fraud. Why is that? Is that
because they're not technically
saved up because they've saved up more for retirement and they're going after those funds? Is that?
Well, they've saved up, but they're also not technically savvy, right?
Yeah. It's a combination.
I think part of it is that there's probably more assets involved, but part of it is also as you're talking about citizens that are older, they're not as sharp as they were when they were younger, like Tyler or you guys and even me. So they're trusting more people to help them manage their affairs. And if those people get compromised or don't do the right thing, it's a greater return, right? It's hundreds of people instead of just yourself getting compromised. And we're moving so fast; it's confusing. As you get older, sometimes your mental acuity goes down, and it's hard to keep up with this stuff. And you've got to rely on advice. And they're not necessarily as savvy on not providing all that PII to a service to help them out.
That's interesting.
And again, how much PII have all of us got out there?
Yeah,
I don't know if I want to know.
Yeah, so many breaches, right? Like OPM.
Yeah, I'm assuming they're going to use a lot of that for like social engineering and furthering attacks, ransomware.
How many of them are going to realize that call about their car warranty is bogus?
That's
right.
Yeah, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. That's still like a thorn in my side, right? Like how your DMV is selling your data, and that whole rabbit hole is really, it's really sad.
Well, here, let me help you get up with your Medicare provider needs to be updated. Let me change who you're sending your money to. Right, same thing, and it's annoying as all hell.
One of the things that really concerns me too is on the OT and ICS side. InfraHalt was a set of 14 vulnerabilities discovered by Forescout and JFrog, some of which focuses on the security of TCP/IP-based attacks, code execution, denial of service, information leaks. More concerning for me is the I would assume one packet DNS response leading to remote code execution. That is not the first time we've seen that, right? Like this is a whole nother round of that. Like if you go back in history, you can kind of point to at least two, like roughly off the top of my head, that have exploited this style of vulnerability that in the TCP/IP stack, I want to say specifically with DNS, right? You send out a DNS request, the response is malformed, and it leads to remote code execution, specifically on these ICS devices. And Forescout has done a ton of research on this. JFrog, to me, is kind of a new player in this kind of realm, but certainly is doing a lot of the security research as well. That's just kind of interesting. Kind of scary. Because when and how are these devices going to be patched? That's the question.
Yeah, PLCs and real-time operating systems with remote code execution or even exploit code in general, like these are designed to be deployed and left in line for 10 to 20 years. Like this is not easy to patch, and a lot of places aren't going to patch, so this is going to be a problem for many things, like for the foreseeable future. Like this is probably a pretty big deal.
Well, and similar to the HTTP server on these devices, some of the PLCs that you mentioned may not have a web server management interface, right? But they've got a TCP/IP stack that is vulnerable, specifically with things like DNS, because they're trying to crunch down. Like it's even more crunched down than your home router. Like your home router has to have a web management interface.
Yep.
On a PLC, it doesn't really need a web management interface, but it needs a TCP/IP stack. Therefore, if I'm a manufacturer and I'm making PLCs, I'm going to go to, I'll use China as an example, but many different examples. I'm going to go acquire a TCP/IP stack for my device because I don't want to write it myself. I mean, you can't really fault, like, if Larry and I were to create a company and be like, we're going to make PLCs, like, okay, Larry, like, let's go write like a TCP/IP stack.
No.
Larry, like,
dude, there are like 6 companies we can license that shit from.
Exactly. And like all of those 6 have some level of vulnerabilities that end up in the same cycle.
We actually talked about one of these fairly recently that pretty much every one of these IP stacks has some pretty horrible vulnerability in them. Lee.
I would say you wouldn't even work that hard, Paul. you'd go out. You're looking for you got your IoT device. You want Ethernet. You want Wi-Fi and maybe Bluetooth. You're just going to go buy the system on the chip that includes the whole TCP/IP stack in it. You're not going to go
build that.
Right. Now, this reminds me of
pop it in and go.
This reminds me of a conversation I had with Josh Wright today. We were talking about something, and he's like, "Oh yeah, like this is in Python, so it should be totally easy. And by the way, I wrote my own PCAP parser, so we don't have to worry about an external library anymore." And I'm like, "Why would you do that?"
Because he's Josh.
There's libraries that parse PCAPs. Like he says, "Yeah, it's almost done." I'm like, "What? Why would you go through this level of pain?"
Because he's Josh.
Because he's Josh. Yeah.
But I also I want to go, and I believe it was still again Mike Poor. We need to get Mike back on the show because he's so
I might know a guy.
He's so prolific, right? But and I believe it was Mike in the many classes I took with Mike. One of them, he was like, RFCs are meant for interpretation. I don't know if it was.
This might have been Josh, but
it might have been Josh or Mike or Steven or Drew, but they all kind of had the same.
Yeah,
they might have all talked about it in my time training with those incredibly intelligent and amazing people, right? And but they were like, RFCs are meant for interpretation.
Sure.
So when you read the TCP/IP specification, there's multiple RFCs that define how you should write your code,
and that's the keyword "should."
Should. You're absolutely right.
Not must.
Should.
Not must. Or will.
Like, it's left to interpretation. So developers have this interpretation as to how they should write the code, and they develop a TCP/IP stack that gets embedded in these devices that is now vulnerable because they interpreted it I don't want to say maybe not incorrectly in a security sense, right? Like maybe correct. I don't want to default to developers, right? Having been a developer, like I would have my interpretion of that.
Yeah. Prime example. We go back to the Johnny Cash, Dave Maynor,
right? And drivers,
yeah, and 802.11 SSID element can be between 0 and 32 octets. Can be between 0 and 32 octets.
Can be.
Yet the field in which you define the variable length field can be defined as FF, which is 255 bytes. But the spec says it should be no more than 32. But you can define up to 255. So the developer says, oh, only 32. I'll only allocate 32 bytes on the stack maximum. And then that comes in and they don't validate that it's over 32. Hold on.
Lee, does that sound familiar with the Linux kernel? How long should we talked about this with the wheel? How long should a directory structure be? That was a hard-coded element that changed over time, and some developers implemented it, rightfully so, the way it was defined at the time they were writing the code.
Yep.
And then it was updated, and new developers implemented it maybe in a different way, but now you've got different interpretations. It is the crux of so many vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah. I remember when I was learning about programming, I think they had something along the lines of when you have limits, it should be like 1, 2, 3, or infinite. You code for a very long value, and you don't try and allow for something in the middle. Because then you're going to wind up in overflow land. But I realize,
but you get like different iterations of that, right? Like that's how we get vulnerable code, right? Is everyone interprets it differently, and then the kind of hard limits kind of change over time, and how well have you kept up in your code? And when we talk about things like the Linux kernel or a TCP/IP stack, we're talking about thousands or millions of lines of code to make sure that you're interpreting it correctly. That was the amazing thing for me, in talking to Wheel, to talk about how we have, MITRE has done a great job with the common weakness enumeration, right? In defining type conversions and path traversal and the various aspects in categories of vulnerabilities. And I'm like, so it was a type conversion. And Will was like, no, it was a type conversion. Yes, Paul, you're correct. But also, it was the developer's interpretation of what the hard limits are. And it was the combination of an incorrect type conversion coupled with the incorrect interpretation of the standard, right? That was really, like, I've been doing security a long time. That was really prolific for me to think about, that it's not just about introducing a well-defined flaw, like a buffer overflow, like a stack-based buffer over, like that's one type of flaw, but it's also like that combination of how you interpreted the standard and the limits coupled with these very well-defined types of vulnerabilities. So recently I bought a couple of books, the 24 Deadly Sins of Software Security. It's like 10, 15 years old. Because I want to understand all these different kind of exploit avenues that largely for the past 20, 30, 40 years haven't changed.
Yeah.
Right? That just is so interesting to me, how some of these things haven't changed. It was actually on the show when we were talking about the common weaknesses in enumeration and how, well, so I have it in my car. 24 Deadly Sins of Software Security, Programming Flaws and How to Fix Them. That was like 10 plus years ago. This book was released. Michael Howard and David LeBlanc, John Viega are the authors. And they're referenced in so many of the common weaknesses in enumeration that I'm like, I gotta go. I want to understand these. Like, these are, because they're still relevant today.
Yep. It's terrifying.
In a sense, it is very terrifying.
Speaking of relevant today, Lee, your story number 7.
Right.
And relevant for today in that Goose found this story.
Oh, yeah.
And Goose, the man running behind things behind the scenes,
production engineer,
without Johnny today, so he's all by himself.
Right,
killing it.
This was covered at Black Hat this year, and it's basically he had given me the presentation link, but the article here kind of explains it. That what they're doing is they're downgrading the number of DNS servers used by Let's Encrypt to verify that you're legitimately requesting a cert for your domain to just a single one, and then pretty much you have that DNS server lie about what it's for, and Let's Encrypt grant you the certificate for that bogus target with the desired domain name. And they found that they could do this on like 25% of servers out there. They could make this happen. And I'm like, holy crap. I mean, we've been looking at Let's Encrypt as really the totally easy button to have decent, encrypted connections on our web servers. And look at that. We can make it less reliable still. I mean, I know it's free.
Yeah,
but
one of the researchers was Dr. Haya Schulman, who we're trying to get on the show to have her talk about this particular vulnerability. Yeah,
that could be a cool segment.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to that. I was kind of enamored with it. This came behind the scenes of Security Weekly, right? We talk about who we're going to bring on the show, who's doing interesting research. This was one of the ones on our list. So, yeah. Really
but cool. They did say that this is not just Let's Encrypt. Like, that's the target and some of the tests they did. But there were other CAs where they were able to utilize some of the same techniques in order to get certificate authorities to do interesting things. So it's kind of an interesting attack path. I'm not sure how they're doing this. This is one I've got on my watch list, but I have not finished yet.
It's kind of amazing when you think about how long SSL and TLS has been around, that we're still finding ways around that in various implementations of it, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, isn't that what we keep coming back to with stuff like that? It's the implementation that gets screwed up, not
always,
the protocol.
Always.
Yeah.
One of my favorite reads, Larry, you were talking about books recommendations, right? Steve Levy, Crypto. I think it's called Crypto.
Really?
The book is called Crypto by Steve Levy. And he kind of goes through like how long that's been around, like when the first standards were created, how they were iterated, kind of over time, and how what is interesting to me is how we're still finding flaws in them today. Given, I mean, you can trace that stuff back to the 70s, right? Those crypto standards.
Yeah.
Related, when I said when we were going to leave here last week, you need to help me pick a book. And
we never did. We didn't.
So I picked one. I started with Confessions of a CIA Spy, which was like 3 hours, almost
Peter
4
Warmka?
hours.
It's Peter Warmka. We have him on the show.
And I started
CIA,
listening, and I was like, and I switched to something else, and I went to The Hacker Crackdown by Bruce Sterling.
Yes.
Right. So, I just did the
Hacker Crackdown is like required reading, and when I listened to that, I was like, "This is required reading for everyone in our field."
We did Masters of Deception,
also required reading,
and so now I'm doing this one afterwards. And I know I've read it before, but it's been so many years because I also have Cyberpunk by John Markoff and Katie Hafner in my library that I need
also
to listen
required
to.
reading. Hacker Crackdown is interesting because it talks about kind of the government kind of take on going after hackers at the time, like air quotes hackers at the time, when you're like, were they really criminals? Like, really?
Yeah.
And they talk about like, oh, we seized all the hard drives and floppies, and like in today's standards that would be 500 megabytes, and we seized 1,000 hard drives and floppies. Like, there's like analogies like that. You're like, wow, that's kind of amazing.
So, and that said, I'm also listening to Code Girls with
I haven't listened to that one yet, but it's on my list.
It's interesting. I find it interesting. I find it fascinating. It was really intended for our two girls. The 13-year-old, I think, is getting part of it. The 7-year-old, the 8-year-old is going way over her head because she doesn't understand the whole concept of World War I, World War II, where the 13-year-old does.
I implore everyone to listen to these books with your children.
Yeah.
In the car because I'm listening to Bruce Schneier, Click Here to Kill Everyone.
Oh.
If you're just getting started in the field, I think it's a great read. For many of us, you could probably skip it, right? But he talks about, Bruce does a great job of kind of breaking down the major kind of attacks, like NotPetya and Stuxnet, and like the significance of them. If you're just getting in the field, great read. Good one to listen to with your kids because they're like, wait, like they turn off the power, Dad? Like in like hackers can turn off the power. It's a good book for that, but for most of us, it's kind of
the other one is Apollo 13 by Jim Lovell.
Yep.
And my wife and I had listened to that. So this is like Jim Lovell, who was one of the mission commander type folks, and telling his story of it and so forth, like the guy who was there as opposed to some of the astronauts and so forth. And the
you gotta get your girls on Cory Doctorough, Little Brother.
Oh my
She's
gosh,
Cory Doctorough has it's a great point, Tyler. Cory Doctorough has some great books as well.
I love that book.
Yep, same. And that's funny. Both of the kids have listened to Ready Player One and Ready Player Two.
Yeah.
And
great movies too. My kids like the movie.
The language is also questionable in both of those.
Sure.
Some of the scenes are questionable in for sexual content for the 8-year-old.
I haven't listened to the book, but we watched the movie.
Yep.
Which is kind of shameful because I do it.
And you know what?
The book is always better than the movie, right?
The movie, in my opinion, is no worse than The Princess Bride. And we make fun with our 13-year-old every time. Is this a kissing book? Whenever a kissing scene comes on, from The Princess Bride, and then there's red faces all around, and it's a joke.
But like kids typically are into video games, and they're like, what's Ready Player? I'm like, guys, it's about video games. Like you're gonna like it, and they watch the movie and they're like, oh, Dad, that was really cool.
Yeah, and like it's video games and 80s culture, which your parents grew up with, and like. The radio in my wife's car, XM radio, was on the 80s station. So they know all of the music.
But you can also, I think it's a great transition to go, probably read the book more than the movie. But like Ender's Game is probably a better one, right? For them to listen to.
Oh my.
Or watch. In either case, I think it's great. It's great. But Cyberpunk.
Yep.
Cyberpunk is one I really like because you got to listen to or read Cuckoo's Egg first, then go to Cyberpunk.
Yep.
Right? Probably Takedown, right,
Okay.
which chronicles Kevin Mitnick
Yep.
from the
Yep. I've done
Kimimura
that one.
kind of perspective,
Yep.
right? And then Cuckoo's Egg, and then Cyberpunk, because Cyberpunk goes through Mitnick, Morris,
Yep.
and the German hackers
Yeah, I
that
can't
are
remember.
behind.
Yeah, and that was
Pengo,
Pengo,
and
yep.
the other hackers on the German side.
Which
of
was
it.
the Pengo from
Cuckoo's Egg.
Yeah, Cuckoo's Egg, yeah.
So definitely go. We have so many book recommendations, but definitely
Yep.
go through all of those.
And that
highly
reminds
recommended.
me, I got to go follow up about my quote nomination to the board for the cybersecurity canon.
Yeah.
There was some delays.
So I just want to say our intern, whose name is Dylan, it was his birthday, and one of our mutual friends was like, "Hey Paul, what do I get Dylan? Like I want to get him a book or something." I'm like, "Cuckoo's Egg is really what kind of got me into computer security." I'm like, "You should get him that." And he was like, "That was a really awesome recommendation." So I think people should really start with Cuckoo's Egg. It's very accessible, and then you can kind of segue into the other. You go into Takedown with Kimimura, right? And you go into Cyberpunk. Shimamura, thank you.
Shimamura, yeah.
And you go into Cyberpunk, and it gives you even more of that backstory into that.
Yep.
So,
And my thing is that we've gotten over the language thing.
yeah.
With both of the kids, especially the younger one.
In a lot of these books, there is very my kids will point it out.
Yeah.
There's colorful language. I've listened to all of these books in the car with my children. They recognize when there's
Yep, they've heard
colorful
it.
language.
If they watch YouTube, they've probably heard it.
They've heard it.
They've heard it from mommy driving in the car because mommy's from New Jersey.
Yeah, but they glean the culture from it too. They're like, can hackers do that kind of
yeah,
stuff?
they're like, Dad, can hackers do that type of stuff as opposed to, Daddy, that guy said fuck.
Right. My poor children, I've subjected them to all these books.
And you know what?
But,
They'll be
but
better
on the
for
plus
it.
side, they've learned. Yeah, they've learned from it.
Yeah. Like, so that was a weird one. And we gave up on the language in that type of stuff in that not last year, the year before COVID, our oldest had to do book reports.
Yep.
During the summer, and the recommended reading they had was one of them was Trevor Noah, Born a Crime.
Mm-hmm.
But it was that on the page. But when you clicked on it to go to Amazon to buy it, it was a Jim Thorpe book.
Mm-hmm.
So we read Trevor Noah, Born a Crime. And you want to talk about language in that book?
Uh-oh.
Everyone in the family listened to that, including at the time the 6-year-old.
It happens.
And that is my 4th time listening to that book, and it does not get old. It is amazing.
I think it's really important to. I like listening to audiobooks in the car with the kids. Regardless of what it is, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, related to cybersecurity, or loosely related to cybersecurity.
Yep.
But, my children have really.
Yep. We did.
They pick up on bits and pieces, and they're more enamored with certain works than others. But it's been really, it's been positive.
We did.
You come out of that basically if my kids took something from this, they can talk about it with me, and it's a positive thing.
We did. Yeah. So we did, and I'm trying to find the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which was the prequel by Suzanne Collins to The Hunger Games.
Yep.
And the kids have seen many of the Hunger Games movies and that type of stuff, and especially the older one. And it was quite a long book, and we listened to that for quite a while. And it was, Daddy, we gotta go to the store. Can we take your truck so we can listen to the book?
Right.
With that one, and it was, which I find weird in that we've tried to get the oldest to read the Harry Potter books. Nope, doesn't want anything to do with them, but loves the movies and has seen every one. Loves them, but won't read the books.
What was the one about the cyborg?
Which one?
I want to end in that. I want to end in that.
Which one?
Next week I'll have we talked about it before. That was a really cool one.
Because I can think of a number of cyborg books. Her. Movies. Her.
No, not an AI. Well,
AI?
no, not an AI, but a cyborg. It was I want to say it was a female author. Really, really good.
People in Discord are yelling at us right now.
But yeah, everyone listening is yelling at us. So.
No, they're
Next
not
week,
actually.
I can't gain access to my Audible easily right now to tell you what it is, but
A female cyborg. What? No, female author with a cyborg.
a female author with a cyborg, and they do this like mission to a distant planet, and the humans bring along with them a cyborg, and the cyborg has these kind of like revelations, and it's a series of books. What is it called?
It's Asimov.
No, it's
It's not the 3 Laws of Robotics with Isaac Asimov and all that stuff.
No, it's people are yelling at us right now in the car because we can't think of what it is.
Murderbot? Is it Murderbot?
Murderbot. Yeah.
Adrian is yelling at us.
Yeah. What was that called? Adrian read it. It's one of his favorite books.
Murderbot. He's saying Murderbot.
Okay.
Murderbot.
That said,
Murderbot Diaries?
That said, go read Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. That's one I got to go back and read.
Oh yes,
yeah. Oh my God, that was so foundational for me when I was in middle school.
Martha Wells, All Systems Red. Thank you, Adrian. All Systems Red was the first one, and there's a whole series. But All Systems Red was the first one. If you want the fiction side of not really cybersecurity, but the whole cyborg kind of thing, super interesting, great story, and definitely one.
And Tyler,
I would say listen with your kids.
Tyler's saying Damon, Freedom TM, and the other one.
Damon is.
I'd argue anything by Daniel Suarez, any of the ones.
Yeah, Daniel Suarez
it's interesting. We were joking lately on a closing note because I know we're running long, but we were joking lately like, oh, when any one of us dies, like there's a whole AI engine in server farm that comes awake that does things after we die.
It is like a dream.
Your kids and friends look at you like, oh my God, like that's amazing. I'm like, no, it's a book by Daniel Suarez called Damon. Like where that actually happens, that we're modeling that afterwards. Like that's
go read
like that could be like not just
that's
fiction,
how I'm setting my wheel up.
Right? That's
Smart
like how we're setting up. There's a whole that's in Marvel too, like a whole like AI engine that spins up after you die that like does things based on the news reports that you've done. Like that's
I'd also
Daniel Suarez did a great job with Damon, Freedom TM,
everything he's done.
Everything he's done.
Everything he's done. What is the other one about? What is it called? Delta V. Delta V was awesome.
Dude, Delta V was awesome. That was
a Suarez?
Yeah, Suarez.
Yeah,
I haven't read that one.
Go do that one. It's a space odyssey, as it were.
Yeah.
Delta
highly
V was
accurate
awesome
too. I did some fact checking on some of his stuff. And
Daniel does a great job of. Damon was his first book, and we were blessed to have him on the show when he released his first book, right? And then he blew up after that because he puts his heart and soul into every single one of his books.
And if you also want a good time on the space side, there's one new one out that I haven't read, but anything by Andy Weir is amazing. Go. Let's put it this way: I was working, I think, with Tyler at the time. And I was listening to one of the Andy Weir books, the first one about the mission to Mars that got turned into a movie with Matt Damon.
The Martian.
The Martian. Yeah, The Martian. I was listening to The Martian, and I had to go to a client site, and it was a 3.5 hour drive. And we weren't sure if I was actually supposed to be on site or not, and that we couldn't get a hold of the contact. And they said, why don't you drive out there just in case? And my answer was, okay. Because I was listening to The Martian, and it was 3.5 hours out and 3.5 hours back. So I had 7 hours that I got to listen to The Martian, and it was totally worth it. And turns out I didn't need to be on site at all, and in fact they weren't actually scheduled to have us out there. But we met our commitments that we needed to. So yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah.
Outstanding.
He autographed a copy of the book for a friend of mine, and what he wrote was, "We're all fucked."
Yep.
Well, thank you for listening and watching this edition of Paul Security Weekly. Larry, take us out.
Over and go listen or read something.